Call the Plan Commission to order. Oops. Can I have a roll call?
Commissioner Miller?
Barbara?
Oh,
calling her.
yes, here.
Commissioner Nealopoulos? Here. Commissioner Underduck? Here. Commissioner Souter?
Here.
Commissioner Solis? Here. Commissioner Thompson?
Here.
Commissioner Sherman?
Here.
Commissioner Van Vechten?
Here.
And Commissioner Mukherjee. We have a quorum.
And the chair is here. We have a couple of housekeeping items before we get into the substance of the meeting. The first would be consideration of the June 21, 2019 minutes. Has everyone in the commission had a chance to review them? And do I have a motion for approval?
I have a quick comment. I was in attendance at that meeting.
Very small typo, I'm no longer a trustee.
Anything else? Can I have a motion for approval?
Motion to approve. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Next is consideration of the minutes of August 28, 2019 Plan Commission meeting. Need a motion to approve?
Motion.
Second.
Any more comments or discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
The minutes are approved. So that was our housekeeping. Can everyone hear me in the back? Except when I do that? I have a laundry list of subjects to sort of go over tonight before we get into the substance of the meeting. Let me begin by saying that at the end of this meeting tonight, we're hoping to get to some kind of resolution. We're hoping to decide on a preliminary recommendation or not. If we don't get there, we won't, but we're trying to. That means that some people may not like whatever decision we make. We don't know because we haven't all sat and talked about it ourselves. I hope that when we all leave here, whatever our decision is, we'll all be friends. We're still going to see each other at Foodstuffs, at Hometown Coffee. We're still going to all live together. So I'd like to just sort of say at the outset that we are trying our very hardest up here. The members of the Plan Commission have spent a lot of hours reviewing this material, asking questions, reading your questions, and taking it to heart. In order to try and make sense of how to get us through the evening and what we need to do, I'd like to let our staff describe their report and their recommendations. They have put the most time. Lee Brown, who serves as village planner, Dave Mao, who's director of public works, James Teague has now joined us as village engineer, Marty, our expert from Environmental Resource Associates. They have spent many hours reviewing the submissions from the developer and putting together recommendations that we have relied on to a large extent. So I'd like to ask Lee to go first, and then my next thought, unless there's a mutiny here, my next thought is to let the commissioners ask questions and let us have some discussion. We have a report that has suggested conditions. The conditions were an attempt at triangulating many different opinions. No one up here agrees with all of the conditions. No one up here necessarily, as written right now, no one necessarily supports them in their current form. So we have to, as a body, deliberate about them. We have to decide whether they capture enough of our concerns and whether they overcome the hurdles that we know go with the process. So after we've discussed all of those materials that we have, what we're hoping is that you will have had the chance to hear how we're thinking. You will have the chance to hear what we've been exposed to, how we have looked at the issues. And my hope is that in doing that, you'll feel less of a need to tell us your concerns, because hopefully you'll have seen that we've listened to so many of them. not that we won't have any public comment, but the thought is to try and limit it only to something that is really new, something that we haven't thought about, something that we're missing completely. But I think you'll be better able to make that judgment about, whether you want to speak or not at that time, based on what we said. And if it takes us 2 hours to get to that point, we're obviously going to have to limit public comment at some point, because we don't want to be here till midnight again. For those of you who haven't been here or are new in the how many here have never been here before to one of the Plan Commission meetings? Okay. So this is our third meeting on this particular application. We started meeting in June. I think the developer and our staff started meeting about the subdivision probably in February or March. There's been revision after revision. The materials that were submitted in June and that we had our first public meeting on were substantially revised. Then we had another meeting at the end of August. This is our third meeting at which we've taken, taking comments and listening to concerns. So we now have a pretty thorough, developed set of questions and tentative answers. We have a report and recommendation that staff has helped prepare, which is a draft. It's just a draft, but it gives us a template for how to discuss and consider these issues. So with that said, if I missed anything, I'm looking over to my team here. If there's anything important that I needed to say that I haven't said, if not, kick me under the table. Lee Brown, would you please maybe begin then by leading us through some of the your staff recommendations and the conditions that we've seen?
Mr. Chairman, in addition to this being the third public meeting for the commission, this is the third staff report that we have prepared, and they build on each other. The current staff report, exclusive of the report that is a draft that may go to the village board. The staff report is 7 pages, and I have a feeling you don't want me to read it. Thankfully, you have all been through it. It is essentially a response to the series of questions that the Plan Commissioners raised following the second public meeting. We took those questions and we have responded in a way that we hope fills information available to you and points to the reasons for our recommendations. I think it'd be more effective if I focus on the conditions that we have suggested may be adopted if you choose to approve the subdivision. Remembering that you have at some point the opportunity to vote in favor, to vote against, or to vote in favor with conditions. We recommend generally that you adopt in motions, positive motions, so that you don't confuse if it's a negative motion. If I vote in favor of a negative motion, am I voting in favor or am I voting against? So we always recommend we place things in positive language. That doesn't prejudice your decision on the language that might be conditions. So what I will present to you are a series of conditions based in part, first and foremost, on our evaluation of the subdivision, second, on the basis of the issues that were raised in the previous 2 public meetings by the public, by the petitioner, and by the commission.
Just made a PowerPoint.
Yeah, it's that mouse thing. You know how bad it is.
What Lee is pulling up right now, is he's put into PowerPoint slides so that everyone can follow conditions that are in a suggested kind of draft report that we have in the packet. It's online as well, but he's put them in a PowerPoint so that everyone can follow along as we follow.
So we broke it down to a series of issues, the first and foremost being stormwater management and detention. The conditions would be placed after a motion for approval with conditions. The first one reads, "The final plat and final engineering plans for the subdivision must address how the proposed stormwater detention system will address extraordinary rainfall events. The system design must incorporate either A, a gravity-fed equalizer pipe that will ensure that any rainfall exceeding the capacity of the southern detention basin be transferred to the northern detention basin and released gradually via overland flow. And or stormwater detention basins of sufficient capacity to accommodate rainfall projections set forth in the updated Bulletin 70 and with the volume required by the most recent versions of the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District's Watershed Maintenance Ordinance, WMO, in effect at the time all necessary permits for the stormwater detention system are issued by the appropriate permitting authority." Mouthful, yes. It is intended to address both the normal rainfall conditions in which the subdivision has two basins, one on the northeast corner, one on the southeast corner, that will detain and slowly release rainfall over a period of time into two different sub-basins, north towards the Forest Preserve District, south towards the existing village stormwater pipes that ultimately lead to the lake. There has been much discussion, and our recommendations reference that discussion, about the need to address a stormwater event that exceeds what had been the WMO up until its update this past June. That reference to Bulletin 70 and its rainfall revision, which has a significantly higher potential rainfall, we're asking that as part of the final plat, they meet that standard or present a hydraulically better standard, and that is what the petitioners had presented in the form of that balancing pipe and the system that allowed overflow to fall onto the Forest Preserve property rather than into the system to the southeast. Mr. Chair, do you want me to stop for questions or move through all of them?
Well, I'm looking at the,
Yeah, no, I think, there's a risk of running over on time, but I think it would be easier if we could ask our questions about
Each
each thing
section.
as you read it.
So long as you allow me ultimately to get through all
Well,
of
yes,
them.
no, I understand the risk of it, but, I mean, if the commissioners disagree with me,
I think that makes
have at
sense.
it. No?
all right, so on this first point, you want to just go around the table? If anyone has a question, you want me to go, Dudley, you want to go first?
I'd like a point of clarification. Thank you. Point of clarification, then the developer will be meeting the new requirements from the Metropolitan Water District.
So this is the duality of this recommendation says they either meet the most updated rainfall requirements that are in place at the time of their permit, or they're providing a alternative that exceeds that standard.
Okay.
So just to be clear, this does not meet the standards that are going to go into effect at the beginning of next year. Is
No,
that
we
right?
are referencing those standards.
We are. So this
Yes.
is the latest and greatest.
That's correct.
Thank you.
And so if they can't get a permit or they can't get the Forest Preserve on board with the hydraulic pipe alignment system, then they would have to default back to the higher standards that you referenced in the condition.
That's our recommendation.
Great.
I have I'm still confused. In subsection A, the gravity-fed equalizer, I thought you were referring to that as being a method that would exceed the standards required by Bulletin 70. Is that what you said, or did I misunderstand?
We believe that the results of that are a greater benefit to the community, and let me explain. It does not have a greater amount of detention on site, but the flow exceeding that detention does not go through the village's stormwater system. It goes overland through the forest preserve, which has a high capacity to absorb that
Assuming
and
they
pass it on.
agree.
So in the extraordinary rainfall event, or even in conditions which will ultimately, if we believe that the rainfall is continuing to increase over time, and that the latest update is simply the current measure of where that is, and it's going to get higher, if we only allow for Bulletin 70, 10 years from now, we'll be talking about Bulletin 70A, but this system will only be based on Bulletin 70. Whereas the balancing system allows for continued capacity above that standard.
Let me, and maybe bring Dave into this too, because I've spent a lot of time with staff asking about this. We have a unique situation here. I was trying to explain this earlier to my wife, and she said, well, if that's so great, then why would anybody want Bulletin 70 if you have this other thing? And I said, well, the difference is, in this particular case, the overland flow, what do you call it, the overflow option to the north, ultimately it goes to the lake, which is a bottomless capacity. Most sites don't have that. So as a village, we should really be, I think, working to try and get approval as an option to have this overland flow. We're not talking about in all events, but only in extraordinary events, because that would keep the water in those events away from the home. So we have a unique opportunity because of where this site is and where this drain pattern goes. Dave, am I summarizing?
That's correct.
Correctly?
May I ask a question? So, this is the extraordinary events. So, are we making clear here for the people who are really care about it that they're also going to have a plan for the regular rain, which we get constantly, it seems?
Yeah, the design that's being proposed has detention on site that will take what currently is what's called sheet flow, the overland flow from the site directly to the backyards of properties to the east, and collect it before it gets to that property line, put it in a detention area, and in two specific directions, pass it off the site without being dumped into the backyards of neighboring properties. They are addressing the typical every week, every day rainfall through this detention system. What we're talking about in terms of these options is the extraordinary event. Where does it go?
But, I mean, my question is, while I have absolute confidence in that, is there a way we can make this more clear so that, because that seems to be the majority of the comments that I've heard, not all of them, but certainly the majority. Is anyone, do we feel confident that this language is going to make our residents feel more confident? That they don't have to go and,
I mean, I think that based on what staff has told us, if a system that it has this extreme event can direct the water to Lake Michigan as opposed to someone's house, I think that's better.
right.
So
Yeah, so we're good, I just want.
that would be my analysis of it, but I'll defer to any expert that's here.
I have a question.
I would say that any final engineering, implicit in the approval of any final engineering, is compliance with the village's stormwater requirements, which are not being applied to this site as it is right now.
Right, okay.
And I understand nobody wants to see water diverted to them on a regular basis, as in the forest preserve, for no good reason. And certainly, they want to ensure that the flows, 90-something% of the time stay the way they're intended to by nature, because they want to preserve the trees and everything. I understand that too. I'm trying to see that this language, my understanding is it distinguishes between what you were calling everyday flow and really extreme events.
If I can draw your attention to, this was not the only stormwater condition we were imposing, so let me read at least the second and third one. The petitioner must, prior to the approval of final plat, obtain an easement to permit connection of the southern detention basin to the terrace court basin storm sewer in a location and manner acceptable to the village engineer and in a form acceptable to the village attorney. This is addressing the daily flow aspect that must go through and connect, at least in this, what we're referencing is the southeast of the two basins, the southeast basin, having an acceptable connection to that existing village sewer, storm sewer, and acceptable means both in capacity and route.
Can I ask a question about the system and the equalizer? On the drawings right now, my understanding is that there are two systems in place. One basically goes to the south and one basically to the northeast. When you install the big pipe, the equalizer pipe, will that cause two independent systems to operate as a single system? Think of two jugs of water with a pipe in between, so that when water seeks its own level, it will kind of tend to even out.
They will, I'll take a shot at that, they will, for those extreme events, they'll essentially act as one system with the overflow for that combined system to the north. For the lower intensity storms, they'll each have gravity discharge, restricted discharge pipes that will drain out, you know,
Right.
to the north and
To the-
overland and to the south,
Right.
east via pipe into the terrace court system.
If they operate as a single system, will the quantity that goes out of the southern detention area increase? Because, you know, you have two bathtubs, they're joined, and they're both draining. Will the overall, now, exceptional, with the exception of 7%, which is headed straight north, now you've got the rest of the site, which is being divided in half into the two basins, right? Will then the two basins discharge roughly half of what's left?
Again, that'll be left to the engineering of both the equalizing pipe and the discharge
Okay.
pipe inverts. So elevation is going to dictate at what
Right.
point the balancing pipe is into play between the two basins.
Okay.
Can I also ask, is it
Thank you.
safe to assume that like multiple daily regular rains will equate to an extraordinary event, right? Which will activate this,
Could-
right?
could
Is that
potentially, depending on
like the
saturated
antecedent
soil and sure.
Okay.
Sure, you know, half inch of rain
continuously following?
following days of rain is going to behave differently than a half inch of rain in the dry part of July.
Sure, okay.
Given, but one of the benefits of the terrace basin system is a relatively short run to its discharge point, so that line isn't going to be surcharged even for those repeated duration events over multiple days. It's going to drain out in a relatively short time frame because it's a fairly short route
Okay.
to the outfall.
Who would be responsible to maintaining that connection to the terrace basin and continuing on to ensure that it continues to flow properly? Is that the developer, the homeowner association, the village?
All stormwater improvements, whether they be the basin landscaping, whether it be inlets and outflows, all those would be required to be maintained by the homeowners association. However, implicit in that, there would be, in the covenants, would be a right for the village to go in and to repair any blockages, conduct any emergency repairs, to lien the property, and then also for us to have set up a backup SSA, which would assess every single one of those properties, so there would be a fund to do it.
Okay. And one more point of clarification. Can you clarify that, so when, let's say, A wins, okay, option A back on number little I, is the developer then on his or her own responsible to proceed with getting all the approvals from Forest Preserve or whoever to get A approved, or will the village actually work with them and the village board work with the other entities to try to get the other approvals required?
The petitioner will seek the permit from MWRD. However, it can't be applied for until after the village signs off on it.
No, okay. I meant A, not the permit. I meant the gravity-fed equalizer.
Well, that is,
It's part of the permit, I
That's-
understand.
well, okay, there's two pieces to that. One is our approval, if it goes forward, and the village's approval of the final plat. We are controlling the engineering on the site, but they still must seek MWRD's approval for the permit. It also is dependent on the Forest Preserve accepting the overflow that would move from or through that balance onto their site, which is not the current flow of water to their site. They will have to, in effect, MWRD will seek the contact with the Forest Preserve and ask the Forest Preserve if they are okay with that.
Okay, MWRD, all right, I didn't know how the relationship was, thank you.
And just to piggyback on that,
Yeah.
the permitting requirements are twofold, with the village and with the MWRD. The village permit review will occur initially, that'll be the first review. Once we have final engineering design completed, that'll be, the petitioner will submit that, our staff will review and approve, and so we don't have review happening on two parallel tracks.
Okay,
What gets submitted to MWRD for permit, ultimately, the village is required to sign off on as a co-permittee, okay, with any MWRD permit.
I understand.
And what's the timing of that? Is that before construction? Is that?
Oh, absolutely, before construction, and how it falls into the timing falls into the ultimate subdivision approval, is something we need to discuss tonight. Typically, it'd be part of the final plat approval.
So we'd get the permit before the final plat approval?
At least the staff review.
I'm not
Or is
sure
it
which
conditional?
permit you're referencing to that.
This
The
WMR,
MWRD may not be issued necessarily prior to
so it's just a
our
condition.
final review of the final plat.
What would the process be if the Forest Preserve or MWRD is uncomfortable with the proposal of dumping the water?
Then this recommendation is that they must meet the Bolton 70 standard on site.
I think as a fallback, I mean, this is just how I understand it. The Forest Preserve wants to protect its natural resources, and I don't think we want to propose a solution that would injure them. And so part of what I understand has to happen with the design process is determining, well, when exactly, when you build a system, does that extreme event result in that? There's probably like a whole spectrum of opportunities. And so I think there are a range of discussions. It may not be an either-or discussion. It may be, we'd like to really limit it to serious events, and we'd really like to maintain the flow as normal as possible most of the time. So that could inform how the system is designed, what the MWRD, what the Forest Preserve is willing to entertain. And that's what we won't know until we see the final plan coming back. Is that my summarizing well enough? Jim?
Yeah, just to go back to the Forest Preserve, sorry to kind of, so are we certain that Water Rec, sorry for the,
MWRD.
is going to be seeking their approval, or is there something that, as the village or as, that we need to do to ensure that's, to ensure that there's a process that's around that approval?
We have the
And
phone
I guess
number.
that's all three of you. I don't know who to ask that to.
I don't think that, well, we are reasonably confident that MWRD is not going to issue a permit without having spoken and gotten a conversational discussion with the Forest Preserve of their satisfaction that the engineering will not harm their facilities.
So we're confident that they're going to be the ones that seek the approval. and
But we will
therefore
continue
would
to
need-
monitor that.
Okay. And we would not need to then insert ourselves as a village to ensure that happens.
This is a complicated question because we have some interest in terms of protecting our residents and accommodating their concerns as well. So to the extent that our staff can be facilitators in helping get that resolved, I don't know that they would, desist from trying.
Let me go back to our recommendation, which is that we believe that the system that includes the balancing pipe and the ultimate overland flow discharge to the forest preserve exceeds the capacity, exceeds the benefit to the adjacent property owners, and therefore it's in the best interest of the village of encouraging the forest preserve to think seriously about accepting it.
Why don't you go on to the next condition and we'll...
One more question.
go ahead.
If for some reason the forest preserve did not accept it, would it be possible to expand the detention ponds? Or detention areas?
Based on this recommendation, the engineering would have to provide capacity within the site to meet the Bulletin 70 standards. Now, we can't, I don't think that we can determine at this stage.
I don't know if we've got enough information at this point.
But I think that would indirectly increase the detention requirement on site. Yes.
And whether they can do that within the existing footprint of the detention area or by deepening it, or that's an engineering aspect on the outfall height. And so they may have to create a greater amount of detention from an area standpoint.
And that theoretically could impact the site plan, but we don't know at this point.
That's correct.
Okay.
The third condition, the petitioner shall make all commercial reasonable efforts to include best management practices for creating better water infiltration at areas other than the detention basin throughout the site. Such practices should be considered and incorporated when beneficial. This is addressing the desire for this not to be simply a triangular basin in the corners of the site, and the potential for actually integrating rain gardens and other infiltration throughout the remainder of the subdivision area itself. And we're asking that they consider best management practices in order to do that.
Let's keep going.
Shall I?
Just a quick question about this one. I found it a little hard to understand, and I'm wondering, would it make sense to somehow tie this to the recommendations of the village, Village Public Works Department, village engineer?
In terms of oversight, that they have met that standard prior to?
Yes.
I think is the landscape plan that's presented, is that going to be tweaked further before it gets to final approval?
The landscape plan itself is a requirement of the final plat,
Right.
not of the preliminary plat.
I understand, but my point is that I believe their expert was talking about the kinds of plantings they would use. So just using this language, would it be reasonable to assume that the village would have an opportunity before the final plan to push for the incorporation of some of those elements where it's appropriate and feasible?
Through the landscape plan, yes.
Okay. All right. So we have a crack at it.
Yes.
Okay. That's.
So the second major area of the conditions focuses on maintenance of the subdivision improvements itself and the declaration of covenants. Do you want to read this, or do you want me to go through this?
I don't have my readers on, so, okay, I'll go with a closer one. The obligation of the homeowners association to repair, maintain in good working order condition, or replace the stormwater detention basins, landscaping, fencing, and other commonly owned subdivision improvements, common improvements, shall be memorialized in the declaration of covenants for the subdivision, which declaration shall be executed and recorded against the entirety of the subject property simultaneously with the plat. I do want to kind of jump off a little bit on this point because I saw some concern from the audience when we were talking about this previously. When you talk about the type of drainage that is being required, even under the current WMO standards, very few if any, of the neighborhoods in Glencoe meet that standard, because they were all developed well before we had stormwater standards. Anything, whether this would be a 3-lot subdivision, a 400-lot subdivision, regardless of how many units you put on this property, it needs to conform to the WMO, and there's going to be common stormwater detention. Someone has to take responsibility for that. And it cannot just be that it's going to be on one lot and that owner is charged with doing, and that owner has to walk around and pass a hat. When you have common improvements, which are required by the WMO to have common stormwater improvements, you have to have a party that is going to be responsible for it. In cases, in other suburban communities that developed later than Glencoe, most often you have a homeowners association. A homeowners association brings with it its own problems. As Commissioner Solon mentioned earlier, that that they're not necessarily maintained, that the governance is always not what we wish it to be. So that's why we have to have a backstop as well, of being able to create a backstop SSA to fund that. But in the end, these common improvements do have to be some party's responsibility, not the village. The village cannot be the primary owner of these. The village does not want to be the primary owner of these improvements. Yeah. The declaration shall be in a form and substance acceptable to the village attorney and shall clearly establish the right of the village to either A, take legal action to compel the HOA to repair, maintain, or replace the common improvements, or B, to enter upon the subject property or any lot thereupon, whether privately or commonly owned by the HOA, to undertake such work as may be necessary to repair, maintain, or replace the common improvements. So this would be basically a standing permission upon very short notice, depending on the condition and possible threat that might be posed, to enter the property and remove a blockage in drainage, to restore flow, to possibly mow the basin if it has become unkempt in such a way that whatever plantings are supposed to be there have become overrun by invasive species. These are all things that have had to be done from time to time, and not necessarily by a village, but that's part of the maintenance of these things.
Let me just make one little comment.
Yeah.
Because I think we put this in here. Besides creating all of these various rights that these documents would do, we asked that the landscape plan not only include what they're planting, but also include a component that's a maintenance plan. What's the scheduled maintenance? Because we wanted the village to have observable signposts. What is supposed to be getting done at a regular basis? And I believe there is a pretty detailed maintenance plan in the package. Is that?
Yeah. Are the cleanouts being conducted? Yeah. Okay, I think we can go on to the next one.
If the village had to go in and perform these emergency duties, then how would we bill them back for
Yeah,
that?
so it could happen in a few ways. We could simply bill the HOA. That's probably what we do first. If we don't get payment within 30 days, we lien all the properties in the subdivision. We would have the right to do that. And then we would also have, if this is something that is actually becoming a chronic problem, we would create the backstop SSA. So the funds for this would be actually assessed on people's property tax bills to create a specific fund that would ensure that there was always money to do this type of work.
The SSA could be established without having money. You could establish it at the subdivision.
Yeah, and we're going to discuss basically with the village what they feel.
Could you say that? Yeah, could you repeat that question? We couldn't.
Oh, when would basically could the SSA be established off the bat? And so yes, it could. So that's something that we would be looking at basically as the final development is being approved.
It would give them notice when they're buying, and subsequent buyers would also have notice.
Yeah. Of course, that's also in the declaration, which is going to show up on your title report as well. This is what I think was just being discussed by the chair in part. The declaration shall include a detailed operation and maintenance plan for the stormwater detention basins and all appurtenant mains. Appurtenant's a fancy word we use that just means associated. mains, pipes, pumps, and other facilities, collectively the stormwater detention improvements, that shall include a schedule for regular cleaning and landscaping, as well as mosquito control measures that will be followed. Okay, this was one of the commissioners had, actually a few commissioners had brought up some issues about Outlot A and what the purpose of that and the access to it would be.
Outlot A is the park.
Yeah, so the elliptical circular area in the center of the proposed roadway, not cul-de-sac, but roadway loop. Outlot A shall be reserved and dedicated in the declaration as open space for passive enjoyment of the residents of the subdivision and the general public. This reservation and dedication shall not preclude the improvement of Outlot A with such accommodations and improvements as picnic seating, benches, shelters, or gazebos, so long as such improvements are open and available to the general public. Outlot A shall remain owned and maintained by the HOA. There's always a discussion when you create these spaces, should they be under the jurisdiction of the park district? More often than not, park districts say, we don't want that. It's a disconnected parcel that's separated from their system. It's hard to get equipment to, so that's often a dedication that they say no thank you to. Okay, maintenance of subdivision improvements, condition 5, Outlot B, and where is it?
Outlot B is the entrance outlot. Essentially, it's just south of the gates to the main road into the site. That is not a part of the developable site. It is adjacent to Green Bay Road.
And so by having an easement for public access and enjoyment, you're not creating basically a private gateway that could be walled off at some time in the future by a spite fence or something like that.
I'll pause if you have questions on that. That's the major set of conditions related to the covenants.
Sorry, just a quick question on the last point. There was a fence there was an image of a fence. Is that at the roadside of that outlot, or is that behind the outlot?
The outlot is adjacent to the right-of-way, both the right-of-way for the entry road and Green Bay Road itself. The sidewalk along Green Bay Road is in the right-of-way, not in the outlot. The sidewalk entry into the subdivision, which passes through an area that has fencing but is open, meaning permanently open, that is within a portion of that. The southern portion of that is within the outlot.
Are we going to be tested on this?
Yes. And there'll be a geography part of this as well.
So just,
If
Okay.
I will try to dig up a map.
It was a
Greg.
tough question to ask. Sorry, I'm just trying to.
We're relying on staff for this.
I think there was previously an image that showed something akin to a gate at one point that was going to be ornamental, and that was requested to be removed to make it clear that this was a passable sidewalk that you could enter the subdivision simply as a member of the general public. So that's what we were trying to establish with that access easement.
Thank you.
Okay. Should we go on to public rights-of-way roads and sidewalks?
just one,
Sorry, Jim.
sorry, Chair. I just have one more, just to go back to the SSA. I think, I know what an SSA is, but that's because I just know what an SSA is.
Yeah.
You may want to just go over it so we all kind of have a really good understanding of what, like the process of that, who governs it, that kind of.
Yeah, so an SSA is a special service area. It is basically where you designate an area, geographically certain parcels that are going to be assessed with an extra tax to pay for a specific improvement or maintenance cost. You often see SSAs in downtowns where they're used to pay for certain streetscaping. Sometimes they're used to pay for actual maintenance. They're they're often used for specific communal improvements that are shared by a bunch of parcels. And so we would basically work with, the village attorney would work with the developer to ensure that this could be set up, that there'd be no ability to object, and that a fair amount would be assessed necessary to cover costs if they were encountered. And that would all be detailed in a development agreement that would be negotiated between the developers and the village, brought before the village board, reviewed and explained by the village attorney, probably Steve Elrod, not me. I'm already talking enough tonight, so, yeah.
Before we move on, one more question. Is the easement, should they obtain it, connecting, their development with the terrace basin, will that effectively become a village easement? Will that remain private? Just curious. Private easement?
So, Dave, I think they're asking about the connection between the actual basin and however they would actually, how the basin outflow would traverse to the stormwater.
Probably, it's going to depend on what easement is acquired.
Yeah,
There's an existing public easement on one of the Carroll Lane lots today.
Oh.
Yeah, so I mean, in general, it would be, we would have a chance to review it to ensure that we felt very confident that that easement could not be blocked or tampered with. But given that it would be a private improvement, the basin connecting to a private pipe to a public utility, in general, we usually have those easements be privately held rather than by the public, up to the point where it actually hits the pipe that we own.
Okay.
Okay. Now we're going on to the third topic.
Public rights-of-way, roads, and sidewalks. The final plat shall include a permanent, irrevocable emergency access easement from the Northwood Drive cul-de-sac to Estates Drive through the side yards of either or both lots 28 and 29, sufficient to accommodate the passage of a, states here, as 10-foot wide emergency vehicle between the two public rights-of-way. This goes back to the original question that is part of the review of the development, is on the question of whether it either blocks or allows for the extension of existing village roads into the site and potentially through the site. This is a, call it a dead-end loop, for lack of another way of describing a one outlet access. Staff, in our discussions internally, have felt, one, that it does provide a greater opportunity to preserve trees on the site, having not been a loop that required a continuous connection of a roadway through to Northwoods. On the other hand, we don't feel particularly comfortable with there being a single access point serving 28 lots, the 29th being directly accessible on Green Bay Road. And we think it's in the best interest of the community, both these potential owners and the existing owners of Northwoods, properties that are served by Northwoods, that there be at least an emergency access easement and potential right-of-way that allows, in an emergency, for a vehicle or a ambulance with a gurney making it across this area into the site in case the roadway is blocked.
I have a question. How's that going to work with the fencing?
There has to be a either unlockable gate, but we are in a subsequent, let me go to that.
Right, because there's the pedestrian.
Right. The final plat shall also include a permanent irrevocable pedestrian easement allowing members of the general public to access the subdivision from the Northwood Drive cul-de-sac. The final configuration and route of such easement shall be approved by the village engineer. The pedestrian easement shall be paved, ADA accessible, and considered a common improvement to be maintained, repaired, and replaced by the HOA. So in addition to an emergency access that could bring a vehicle under a dire situation, we are saying there should be a permanent sidewalk for pedestrian access.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to add, you also could place utilities in that easement as well, underneath the
Utilities
sidewalk.
will be required to interconnect between this subdivision and Northwoods, I think the
Typical water.
water main itself. So there will have had to have been an easement for those utilities. We would like for that to be shared with the sidewalk location. Three is no sidewalk shall be required to be installed on outlot A, C, D, or E. A is the open space, the looped open space. C, D, and E are at the northeast corner, southeast corner, and northwest corner. D and E are stormwater areas. C, I believe, is simply to allow for the lots in that northwest corner to meet the subdivision requirements in terms of average lot width. We don't need sidewalks on those outlots. However, everywhere else in the subdivision, we are saying there should be sidewalks on both sides of the street.
May I ask a question about that?
Yes.
What, given the size of this new neighborhood, is there an underlying policy or rationale to have sidewalks on both sides continuously for the length of the street versus what they are proposing where it's two sides around the loop and then one side from Green Bay to the loop?
The village's standard within the subdivision ordinance is both sides of street. From a professional standpoint, from a planning standpoint, from a parental standpoint, I don't want my kid to have to cross the street to use the sidewalk.
I ask because there's a lot of locations in the village where there is only one side.
Or none.
Or none.
Right.
Along Old Elm, even Northwood. So I'm just asking if there's a policy in the village to improve that everywhere.
You have a recommendation from the Sustainability Task Force, and that it meet ADA requirements, and that's part of the ADA standard is a sidewalk. Both sides.
Excuse me. Another quick question. The location of the sidewalk, will there be a planting strip or will there be a curb sidewalk and then grass? Or hasn't that been determined yet?
We don't have the detail. The standard within the village's subdivision ordinance is it's a curb, grass, sidewalk,
Okay, thank you.
meaning not a carriage walk.
Back to Romanet 2, it's a common improvement to be handled by the homeowners association. Would it be appropriate to put in the same requirement that if they don't, the village can step in and bill and impose an SSA?
The common improvements that would be used by the public or that could impact the public, we would consider those to be all subject to the condition that we previously discussed in the covenants.
Right.
Four is the new entry gateway design for the subdivision is recommended as presented in the application, but with the exception that the sidewalk remain open without a closable gate. This was written prior to the developer modifying their graphics and plan to eliminate the
Closable gate.
gate.
So we don't need this.
Right.
Okay.
6 is that any entrance signage at the Estates Road entry to the subdivision conform to the village's sign ordinance.
Goes without saying.
I actually have a question about this because I tried to look up the village's sign ordinance, and I'm not sure what will the village require or limit with regard to the sign. Like, if I looked at the plan correctly, and none of us focused on this because there were many more important issues. is it a monument sign? Is it something more like Skokie Heights where it's a nice wooden pole with a sort of a shield?
Well, they have presented in their documents what amounts to a monument sign
Is
as a
that
piece
allowed?
of the entry feature that includes the fencing along that area.
Is that something we do? I couldn't tell if that was allowed. This is this is zone residential, right?
Correct.
So is that allowed?
We have examples of entry signage within the village. Skokie Heights,
Does our code make an exception for entry sign for a subdivision as opposed to just a street or is that, they primarily identify a larger area? Is that the purpose of them?
it's primarily only proposed in subdivisions of some number rather than single lot or multiple lot subdivisions.
So there is a monument sign for Skokie Heights? Because I've seen the white sort of pole with the big shield that says Skokie Heights as I've driven by, but I'm not, have I seen a monument?
I don't think you've,
Yeah.
Okay, so that is something we have.
sort of like vanity plates.
Yeah.
Let's keep going. Please. Please.
That all improvements, realignments, restriping, and other traffic control improvements necessary to align Wesley Road and Estates Road, and to reconfigure the lanes, turn lanes, traffic advisory signs, and other traffic control devices recommended in the revised traffic impact study from KLOA, last revised August 16th, 2019, be the responsibility of the petitioner to fund, and unless required otherwise by the village, construct in accordance with all the applicable road construction standards.
So this draft recommendation essentially is to adopt the proposed street improvements that we've seen in the application package.
Correct, and to
As
ask,
last revised.
and to have the developer pay for it.
Right. Which, to be clear, includes, where it goes down to 3 lanes, includes this speed limit reduction. Just to be clear, that's everything we've seen here. We skipped over the condition regarding the existing gateway features. This was Commissioner Van Vetchen's comment. Do we want to take that up now, or is that a special?
We have a gap area, if you'd like to do that. I mean, that we actually, in the document, left a hole in that, but
Do you want to talk about it now, Peter?
I'm proposing, am I on? Yes. I'm proposing an additional condition regarding the masonry entrance gates that are historic. And I'll
Peter,
read-
could you drop your mic just a little bit?
I'm proposing an additional condition regarding the masonry entrance gates that are historic. And I want to read you a short portion of a letter that Earl Hoover wrote. They, the carved stone figures and urns, reportedly appeared on the old palace of the Louvre in Paris, which was destroyed in the French Revolution. Some 28 or 30 of them thereafter were purchased by Mr. William K. Vanderbilt of New York to be included in a stable he was building. There were some left over which my architect, Mr. William First of the architectural firm Armstrong, First and Tilton Architects for North School, Village Hall, Library, etc., which he learned about. They were in some sort of a junkyard in lower New York, and some 8 of them were purchased and put into the entrance gates of my palace. They seem to be of historic interest. He was correct. There are quite a bit of precedents for entry markers around the village, from ravine bluffs, which are owned and maintained by the village, to other ones such as Rockgate, Skokie Heights, Skokie Ridge, and so on, which are owned and maintained by their respective homeowner associations. Currently, the developers of the Hoover Estate are proposing that the gates would be owned and maintained by the owner of Lot 1. My suggestion is that in order to preserve their long-term existence, basically preserve them, and the maintenance of these gates, so that it's not all on one person, I suggest the following condition be adopted as part of the recommendations. The masonry entrance piers, walls, and land they stand on be donated to the village of Glencoe. The maintenance of the same would be the responsibility of the new homeowners association. By donating to the village, that would assure their long-term existence. Donating the structures to the village may allow the developers to realize a tax deduction, and having the homeowners association maintain the gates in lieu of only Lot 1 would spread the economic responsibility across the subdivision.
My suggestion is that we hold this to the side, and we take up all, any editing to conditions or other concerns at that point. Let's come back to it then, because I want to get through all of them, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to suggest that, and
Thank you.
we'll certainly address it.
That was the end of the public rights-of-way, roads, and sidewalks, and I'll pause in case there are questions.
Okay, keep going.
Hearing none. Tree protection and landscaping. Petitioner will be required to enter into a subdivision and development agreement requiring the implementation of the tree protection plans as presented in the application and as otherwise required by the village code for both the common improvements and private lot development, subject to the review and approval by the village attorney. The development agreement will memorialize and quantify the petitioner's commitment to planting substitute trees on the property where feasible, with the specific exceptions or limits to the determination of where feasible to be adopted prior to the approval of the final plat. Three, the development agreement will incorporate a tree replacement plan to be approved by the village arborist to assure that competitive canopies or root disturbances are not likely to result in future tree losses. The development agreement will require that the removal of existing trees or plants, including invasive species like buckthorn or other removable trees, not create nuisance conditions on surrounding parcels, including, without limitation, unreasonable runoff or herbicides or soil erosion. The development agreement will require that the perimeter fence proposed to be installed around the subdivision be a uniform board-on-board wood fence at a perimeter of the subdivision on lots 1, 2, 3, 10 through 22, 28, and 29, and outlot B, E, and the western side of outlot
C, I think.
C.
I think.
Thank you. And a wrought iron look fence at the perimeter of the subdivision on lots 23 through 27, outlot D, and the northern side of outlot C.
Questions about tree protection, landscaping, fencing? So, to summarize where we are at this point, the nature of the recommendation that is provided in the report is on its face fairly simple. This is just draft for discussion, would be that the Plan Commission recommends approval of the preliminary plat with conditions and modifications as more fully described below, and these are the conditions we've been looking at. The recommendation also includes granting variations that we've talked about before, a variation from the minimum dedicated right-of-way, and some others here, a variation that the requirement that the subdivision be connected to a public road along to the existing Northwood Drive. We didn't talk about the variations. We have had them presented in the past. As the staff report describes, they enable the applicant to save more trees and don't have adverse effects to the village in terms of public safety and access. I don't know if you want to comment on them further, but this is just to sort of step back from the, in the process here. We have all the application materials. We have staff recommendations that implementing the traffic improvements that were described in the application will adequately address the traffic issues for the subdivision and be safer in some cases for our residents when they, for example, have pedestrian crossing across Wesley. We have recommendations, as you've seen from our staff and our consultants, on how to approach the stormwater issue because we know that's of great concern to you. We have recommendations about how to make sure that the improvements that they're supposed to put in are actually put in and actually maintained through the use of recorded covenants, through the use of a special service area, and through having detailed requirements in terms of a tree protection plan, an operation and a maintenance plan. So we have an expectation of what's going to be done here. And I think you've heard from commissioners how we have questioned some of these conditions, what they mean. I'm going to ask the commissioners if they want to have some discussion further about these conditions. And if everyone wants to take a pause or needs a little space to think, then this might be a time for some public comment. But I first want to just ask everyone around, what's the sense here right now in terms of our need to discuss further these conditions? Do we think that they are expansive enough? Do we think that they would be protective enough? Do they think that in combination with our review of the standards, they do the job? That's really a question for discussion.
Backtrack 30 seconds. One more question before we discuss. Back to stormwater. I understand, the MWRD process, and so we're looking at the whole development as from a bird's eye view. When we start to fine tune and go into each home, I don't know if it's applicable for me to ask this here, but just curious again. So the MWRD's ordinance is improving, let's say, being refined. So when each individual homeowner will come in and apply for their own building permit to build their home, their patio, their, what have you, what does our village code say in terms of, has our code also evolved to kind of accommodate either Bulletin 70, or will it evolve, or does it already fulfill the new rainfall data? And because then we also have those neighbors might start saying, you also want to protect those people that are moving in as well, because then will become also village residents, which we will care about as well. So how do we protect the neighbor to neighbor issues and those things?
Good question. The development at this time has to assume conceptual improvements on each of the 28 lots that are interior to the subdivision. And that includes the proposed building footprint and some level of impervious coverage on the lot, driveways, patios, etc. That will all be part of the preliminary calculation that'll determine and size stormwater detention for the subdivision as its entirety, including the roadway, all the impervious for the site. As each individual lot comes in, they will in turn be required to submit and go through our engineering grade plan review process, where we will then look at the specifics of what is ultimately designed on that lot, see how that impervious coverage on the lot compares to what was assumed conceptually. If it's at or less than, then there still will be stormwater requirements to tie into the same system. But if it exceeds that, there may then in turn be requirements to provide additional stormwater detention on those individual lots if they're in excess of what was initially conceived. If that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. Thank you.
Stu, I just want to go back to this for a minute. Our recommendation, we're an advisory body, and we make a recommendation if we adopt one. The village board receives our recommendation. What do they do with it? Are they bound by our conditions? They can add to them, they can modify them. What do they do with our report?
The village board looks to you as the deliberative board that listens to all these facts, listens to the public comment, takes that into consideration, and then does what they want. Not to be facetious, but the idea is that this is solely a recommendation, and so I think that in practice, the village board will look very seriously at what you guys proposed. They are not limited by that. If you recommended approval, they are not bound by that. If you recommended denial, they are not required to have a higher vote threshold. They are going to look at this with the record that you provided, but your vote is solely as a recommendation tonight.
All right, one other housekeeping item. A couple of the commissioners that are here were not here at all of the meetings, but they have told us that they have reviewed the videos and the materials from the meetings that they missed. So anyone who would be voting tonight, I'm looking at any commissioner, tell me otherwise, has seen or reviewed all the materials from these meetings. So I guess I'm asking, I know that there are people who represent groups of owners who want to speak. It's 8:45. I think if we give ourselves, start with, say, 30 minutes at the outside for comment, that would give us a chance to try and get out of here by maybe 9:30 or 9:45. Not that we're going to ignore what you say. I'm trying to see, some path here. I hope you can see from our discussion that we've taken this very seriously. Even if you think we've missed a point or you don't agree with the conclusion we've reached, when we debate these conditions and we talk about it, we've really tried to identify everything that we thought could go wrong and to try and prevent it. But if you have something to say now, I think this would probably, I think we have time. I don't want to cut off any discussion, but I would ask that you, try and limit yourself to just a couple of minutes. If there's 20 people that want to talk and it's 2 or 3 minutes, we're already here for an hour. And bear in mind what we've been talking about, how we're trying to condition any recommendation that we might vote on, and try and provide us with anything that you think would be helpful to us, that you think we need to hear, because we're interested still if there's something else. And there it is. So I'm not very good at pulling the hook on someone after 2 or 3 minutes, but really if we can try and keep comments short, except I think there are a couple of people speaking on behalf of a group, and so a little more time for that, because and then if someone's speaking on behalf of your group, then please don't also get up and speak. Let's try and keep it that way. So we begin with Jim and Emily Borowski. No? Okay. Rick Rosen.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak. I wanted to address the board here, maybe in a little bit more of a dialogue format here, but we've not really had the opportunity for. There are a number of omissions and, quite honestly, issues with the stormwater management plan that has been proposed. Now, I understand that this is a preliminary stage, and that for a typical development of 1, 2, 4 houses, a lot of these issues and omissions, they can be dealt with in a final stage. We're not dealing with a typical development here. We're dealing with truly an extraordinary development of 29 homes and the ability to affect another 40 or 50 homes, one of which is mine. So I think that the number of these omissions and a number of these issues really deserve to be dealt with at this stage as part of a preliminary plan, not kicked down the road. Because as we all know in project planning, if you delay changes to later on in the project, your ability to make changes will be less and the cost will be more. So what I'm going to discuss is that I think these are changes that need to be made now as part of the preliminary plan. Let me explain. And I apologize to the audience, but I have some presentations. They're different from these because I think, Dave, you said, and Phil, you said you wanted to see something new. I have new material, so I think we can actually take this down. I apologize to the audience. There's graphs that I'm going to present to the commissioners. And loud enough, I probably need a microphone. I hope you can see this. And I want to point out some of the issues with this design. These are cut and pastes from, I believe, format from the previous pack. And what I've shown here are the detention ponds. And what I want to point out, and again, this that I've highlighted in red, this is the high water mark for the detention ponds, the high water mark for the two different detention ponds. What I want you to notice is how close these are to the homes. These red dots are based on a 1989 reality. These homes will live in the 21st century. We were talking, and the difference that we're talking about here is, let's be precise. First off, let's be precise in our language. The extraordinary event that we're talking about that is legally required by the HMO is a 100-year storm, 24-hour duration. In this case, these ponds, these red lines, correspond to 7.5 inches of rain. The 21st century reality will be 8.5 inches of rain. If these ponds are built as they are, the 21st century reality will flood these homes. There's a problem. It's not true. Okay. All right. So, and I believe in the packet, I think in the letter from Dave Brown, they described that these ponds would have to be up to 30% higher volume. Let's talk a little bit about the specifics of the ponds. And these are, again, this is a drawing, again, cut and pasted out of a previous presentation. And these are a side view of the two ponds. There's some typos on here. This is actually basin number 2. This is the northeast pond. This is the southeast pond. The first problem with these ponds...
Rick, can I just ask you a question? We've talked a lot about the fact that when the ponds fill up, there's a mechanism for the water to go elsewhere. Are you worried that when the ponds fill up, they're going to spill over into the houses? We haven't. Well, if they fill, I see the red line, but what is it you want? If once it gets to the red line, what do you think happens next?
What I'm saying is this red line is not an accurate representation.
Well,
so that we're talking about more flooding within
well,
these houses.
you're saying that the water would fill up because the basins don't hold enough.
Right.
But we've had all this testimony that we're going to send excess water north if we can, or we're going to have more storage on the site because well, they're not building what's shown on the plan today. They have to build what's approved in the final plan.
Agreed.
So, you're saying that when the water gets to that level, there's a problem, but that's not what we've been hearing. So I'm trying to understand why you think it's a problem.
I guess I would leave it up to the commissioners. Would you buy these houses? That's pretty darn close to your back door.
But that's a different concern than you're raising. That might be their concern,
that's the
but.
first concern. There's another concern, and it may continue.
Well, sure. If you want us to understand your argument, help us understand it. That's what I'm saying. Well, if the argument is that the water is going to flow to the houses, all of our testimony from our staff and our consultants is that's not where it's going to go that way. So, is there something we're missing about why it would do that?
That the boundaries of these red areas, they are conservative. These are 1989.
Right, but the capacity is not just the depth of the basin. The water flows out of the basins to other places, so it's not a static quantity.
Yes, no, that's true, because obviously these don't hold all of the rainfall and then release it days later. It is constantly being released.
So you're not saying that it's going to go into the houses.
I'm saying that the upper limit of these basins, as by the developer's own drawings, appear to me to be very close to the houses.
Does that take into account the water being pushed out into the forest preserve if it does go that way? These calculations that you're referencing here?
Yes, they take into account that these things are draining during this. Again,
Sorry, my question wasn't whether they drain because the rate at which they drain has been calculated. My question is, when formulating those solid red lines, do you take into consideration in your calculations that anything that exceeds the capacity of the basin would be pushed onto the forest preserve if we went that route.
You're talking about option A.
Yes.
I don't believe so. These are not my calculations. These are the developer's calculations. I believe that the Water Reclamation District would have a say in how these calculations are done. Let's get to that point.
Is this option B that you're showing? Or
This is option B.
But is this with the detention basin size for the updated bulletin?
No, this is option B.
We're recommending, I mean,
Right.
our
Yes.
recommendation
Correct.
is different.
And the recommendation would be worse than this. Because option B requires to hold the water. It means these basins need to be larger.
If those basins are larger, that they may lose a lot, but that would be their choice. We haven't, they may have to come back to us and,
Absolutely.
right.
I agree with completely.
So how would you want us to change the recommendation? That's what I'm not understanding.
That the two.
The recommendation is either to have enough capacity to overflow in these extreme events or store more water even than they're showing now. How would you want us to change that recommendation?
To store more water than shown.
Well, that's what our recommendation is. We're doing what you're asking us to do.
I'm saying that this does not represent recommendation B.
Well, we're recommending what we have in our report.
I'm sorry.
We're not recommending that. We're recommending what's in our report.
Right.
I think we've done with
Okay. There's a couple of other pieces of information that I think that you're missing on that I haven't heard discussed here.
Okay.
Let me continue. These basins need to be drained by gravity, correct? And for the southeast basin, there's no problem with that. This is going to drain into a sewer. It's going to drain like crazy. The northeast basin, there is no storm sewer for this to drain into. The bottom of this basin is at 675 feet. For this basin to drain dry, it needs to discharge to, I don't know, 674 feet, correct? So how are you actually going to drain to 674 feet if you don't have a pump? You're going to have some way, and you're going to actually have a pipeline going from that northeast basin to actually find a point where it can drain.
Can you hold off there? We'll try and get an answer to that, because that seems like a very simple technical question. I would be surprised that my staff and everyone else that we're relying on would not have had thought about how water will drain out of the northeast basin.
By gravity.
Which of my team there can discuss this?
Well, the way the system is proposed is that there's a gravity drain out of for low flow out of both structures, both detention areas. The elevation of that northeast basin is yet to be finalized. That's part of the design. The balancing pipe between the two will drain out, ultimately drain out that northeast basin following a major event.
But to drain...
There's the plan as proposed. There's no proposed need for any conduit to be extended into the forest reserve.
But then how does it drain down to the level of the bottom of the basin? To 675 feet. How does it drain down by gravity? It has to have a path to say 674 feet.
Now, it doesn't have to drop a foot. We need minimal grade to be able to drain out that basin. That'll be ultimately the final design review.
Okay. Well, let
me suggest this, because part of the purpose of the meeting is to hear information, and with all due respect, when we have all of the engineering talent we have looking over and reviewing their engineering talent, we need to hear information that is really well researched, because otherwise everyone else wants to talk, and unless you're going to change our thinking about how to proceed. That's what I'm saying. So
I believe it. Yes, I believe I can. Okay. The other thing to remember, and what I'm showing here, is a topographical map of where you intend to discharge the water. I assume you're familiar with how to read some of these topographical maps, but these are lines of equal elevation. If you walk along one of these brown lines, you're either going up or down. If you walk across the brown lines, you're going either up or down. And that's the way the water's going to go. It's going to go downhill. What I'm showing here is this is the corner of the estate these are all the houses on the north part of Terrace Court, right? If you just discharge this water into this area, this is a very large, flat area. In a case of high rainfall, this water can actually start to work its way down and actually add to the flooding of these other houses.
But wouldn't that be considered as part of the final engineering review? I mean, they haven't worked out all of these details, but they all know the same information. They know that that would be something to avoid.
What I'm pointing out is a number of omissions in the design.
Well, the question for us is it reasonable to assume that the solutions that they're going to come up with are feasible, that can be implemented? We're at a preliminary stage. It's not that they have to do all of the final engineering. The question is it reasonable for us, based on the evidence that we have from engineering consultants, that they can come up with a solution that will work?
Absolutely. I have no doubt that they can come up with a solution that will work.
That would avoid some of the problems that you're pointing out.
Absolutely.
Right.
They will. But the question is that, how will that affect the plot?
Well, it's their risk. If they come back to us with final engineering and they have to modify lots, they will have to modify lots. But that's their risk in proceeding forward at this point. But from our standpoint, as a preliminary approval, we just have to ask ourselves, is there enough basis to conclude that they can solve these in a good way? Not that they have to have done all the work at this point.
I believe that they can solve them, but I think the board deserves a complete answer of how is the water not just going to go into the detention ponds.
The problem with that is that we have a two-stage process, and we give owners and applicants the ability to ask for a preliminary approval before they undertake all of the rest of the studies and cost of developing a final plat. They still have to come back for approval for the final plat. So it's nothing more than that.
Were there any other points that you wanted to raise?
Yeah, I do. There is one other point, and this is, I think, there are some other omissions. 2 minutes. The water, to avoid flooding this area, and actually, it's actually quite simple. It just needs to get down into this particular geological depression, and then the water's going to go flow north. It will then hit up by the metro tracks. It will then go into this detention, and then underneath the metro tracks. Now, the issue with this is, I don't think everybody realizes all the stakeholders involved in this water flow. For instance, who owns this pipe? It's actually not the forest preserve. This slice of land belongs to the golf course, right? So you've got the forest preserve, you've got the golf course, you've got not only Metro, but you've got Northern Pacific, and then you've got the other issues about maintaining, again, this critical detention, this critical culvert.
I think we're aware of it. I don't think it changes where we are in terms of evaluating a preliminary plan, but I think we're aware of what you're saying. I've asked Dave now many times whether the choke point exists, whether that culvert's sufficient, and staff tells me that they believe it will be.
And Dave, Mayor, can you confirm that the golf course is owned by the village? That's village property?
No. This is the Lakeshore Country Club.
Oh, it's Lakeshore.
So, it might be, I'm going to ask some other people to speak. It might be at this time that we just have a disagreement about what our role is at a preliminary plat review level.
Yes.
We may just have a disagreement about that.
Yes. And my point here is twofold. I want to point out that there's some serious omissions on how the water is going to go to its final outfall. I believe that these are serious enough omissions that for a project of this magnitude, they should be addressed now.
Okay.
Again, this is not 1, 2,
Okay.
4, 5.
I think we understand your concern. Let's move on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alan Lons?
My question too was, how is the water getting from the north basin to the water divide, which is basically what
Okay. Bonnie and Mike Balkin? Jennifer Apt?
my question is,
We might ask you to come up there just so everyone can hear you.
before there's a homeowners association, before people are actually buying the homes, who is responsible for all these homeowner situations if there's a huge rainfall before, and flooding before?
I'm going to, my quick answer, but then I'll let Dave or one of these more knowledgeable people correct me, is that when you do a subdivision, the stormwater improvements have to go in first. You can't like do all the lots and start selling houses before, but I'm going to let one of you more knowledgeable people talk about that.
Yeah, so the answer is that's a lot easier because we know that there's one person, and he's sitting in this room, would be the party that owns the property, the developer. So, but more importantly is the answer that Bruce gave, is that our development agreement, in fact, our whole subdivision code requires that all of these improvements that are designed to do our best to ensure that the development of this property does not impact surrounding properties go in first. So before a foundation is poured, you're going to have the stormwater basins that are built, because you can't build, 1/29th of a stormwater basin. You build those first, and then the development and impermeable surface fills in afterwards. And then usually at a certain point, depending on how their covenants are written, there's going to be a trigger point after some percentage of the lots are sold that the common elements are going to be handed over to the HOA. But that's not like 5%. It's usually well over 50. So there has to be an actual base that is going to be able to generate the revenue necessary to maintain those.
The second part is, so one, you put enough in place, you do the best you can to prevent all this flooding, then what if something does happen and the homes in the first court do flood again and there are issues, who's responsible?
So if the system doesn't work as well as it's designed to do, it's designed, according to what we've seen so far, to reduce the flow by 80%. If it works only half as well as it's designed to do, it's reduced the flow, help me with math, by 40%, or maybe, maybe it's not linear, I don't know. If the system failed entirely and only operated as the current undeveloped site works, you're right where you are anyway. So the system would have to have somehow the system would have to fail in a way that made things even worse than the natural state. I've asked many times, is that really possible? If it's graded this way, right? Is it graded so that the water is caught in the system? If it's held by the system, is there a possibility that more water can be released in some catastrophic release that could happen even with the natural condition? I'm going to ask someone here to respond to that question.
Well, the key, as we've said in August, the key to this design is the overflow, the capacity of that overflow, the width of that overflow. We're in that northeast basin. This isn't a small diameter pipe. This will handle the overflow for the connection of the two basins in any event, 100-year storm or beyond. And there's no mechanical component to it. There's nothing to fail.
There's nothing to restrict it in that sense. I mean, I asked early on when I saw those basins, is this like a dam? Is this like something that could break and fall in, where a wall of water could fall at you? Because that would frighten me. And I'm going to ask you again, how they're designed, that's not how they would function. Is that right?
That's correct. This is some below grade, some above grade with berming around the side, but there'll be a certain elevation difference between the top of that berm and the elevation of that spillway. Typically, we want to see a one foot of freeboard, so that and the width of that will determine, will control the capacity of how quickly that can drain water out during one of those extreme events. Keep in mind the restricted release in the two basins. That's going to be a relatively small diameter pipe to control its release both into the storm sewer system for the southeast basin and into the forest preserve where it currently discharges today for the low flow condition. That's a relatively small diameter pipe. The overflow is not. It has much greater capacity.
Is another way of describing this that you're creating, because of grading and the way you're directing the flow and the fact that you're relying on gravity, you're creating a passive system. It's not a system that needs to be shored up with mechanical components, right? Is that, you're trying to minimize the number of things that could go wrong. Is that is that?
And you stabilize, the constructed berm is going to be earthen for most of it, soil material packed in place with appropriate vegetation to maintain the slopes. Where that overflow is, that's going to be a surface, a hardscape surface of some kind, either stone or concrete, so that it over time doesn't wear down. That elevation doesn't. That key elevation that needs to be maintained is that overflow. So that'll be done. We haven't seen the final design on it yet. That'll be done by alternate means than just a grassy notch in the berm.
I mean, I go back to something that one of you, maybe Stu, you said earlier, that any new subdivision in the village has to provide detention like this. The detention on all of these new developments, this is how they all are intended to function. Trap the water, release it at a controlled rate. So, if this was a 3-lot subdivision going in next to you, they would have to provide some detention like this.
Correct. I think we noted in August we've got a 12-lot subdivision over off of Hofelder Road that has 2 backyard basins, similar concept, 1 outflow that is maintained by the private property owner, overseen by the village. We have that on a regular checklist to make sure that vegetation doesn't get, doesn't clog the outlet pipe for that. It's been in place for 15, 18 years without incident.
Ann McPhee?
I'm Rick's wife. So I just wanted to clarify a couple things. I hope the notes reflect the tone of voice that Bruce used when he spoke to Rick. I also want to clarify. I hope the notes clarify the tone of voice that Bruce used when he spoke to Rick. Because I did not. Sorry. I hope that the notes reflect the tone of voice that Bruce used when he spoke to Rick, because I didn't feel that it was respectful, and I don't think you were listening to what Rick had to say. I also wanted to note, because Rick would not say this himself, that he has a PhD in engineering from Berkeley. Okay, he's not an idiot. He spent a lot of time looking at this. It was a very thoughtful analysis, and we've spent a lot of time thinking about this project and looking at the evolution of this stormwater system, and there have been multiple mistakes made. I'm also an engineer, likewise. Okay. There's been multiple mistakes made by the engineers in these systems. So in one of the versions, there's a pump. Clearly, when you're developing a system like this, a pump is an inappropriate choice. Pumps need electricity generally to work, and when we have storms, electricity gets cut off. So there's been all these changes. So one of the things I think Rick was trying to point out was that the engineers so far have not shown a thorough and thoughtful analysis of the problem, and we wanted to point that out to the Plan Commission. There was also, I think, a lot of confusion about the red triangle. Okay. That data comes from the developers, and it's marked on the plan as the high water line. So that basin, and I think maybe we need to clarify engineering concepts here too, right? There's volumes of rainfall and there's rates of rainfall. And what these ponds are is like a bucket with a hole in it and a pipe flowing in, right? So we all know if the flow of water going into a bucket is more than the flow coming out the outlet, the bucket will overflow. In this analogy, those basins are the bucket, right? The rainfall is the pipe going in. The ability of that bucket to drain is the pipes coming out of the basin. The way the basin is designed is that there's a limited outflow. So if the inflow of water during a storm is higher than the limited outflow, the basin will fill up. It will reach the high water mark. It's designed to do that, Bruce, okay? The engineers who drew the drawings designed the high water mark. They designed a high water mark that reaches the edges of the house. That seems odd to me. I don't think I would be super comfortable buying a house in which the basin in my backyard is designed to reach my house. right? That seems like a really poor engineering choice. So Rick didn't make those numbers up. He didn't make the picture up. That's what's happening. And that's the basin that's designed for the 1989 era flows, right? So we all know that rain has gotten substantially heavier in Glencoe in the last 30 years. So, and we also know from the drawings, and I know not everybody here can read engineering drawings, but those cutaways show the depths of the basin. And in one of the lots, in one of the basins, it's 6.5 feet deep, and the other it's 5.5 feet deep. So imagine, that's a really deep basin, right? So I don't see any provisions for safety, like animals can drop into those basins, kids, whatever. You know, that's a super deep basin. So for them to make the basins bigger, when they use the up-to-date rainfall curves, the basins really can't get a whole lot deeper because it's gravity flow at the bottom, and they're already super deep. So that means they have to get bigger, which means those houses have to be substantially, either they're moved, they're changed, whatever, just as you said. And I think that's what Rick was just trying to point out, that as it, you know, we need more information about how this is going to work so that you have a better understanding. Because right now, whatever plans that have been put in front of you are not the plans that will be at the next stage. Not only do we have this issue of rainfall, but we also have the issue of adding sidewalks. So once we add the sidewalks, they have to completely redraw the design. So what's the point of approving something at this point when this design is going to be completely changed? So I wanted to talk about that, right? And I hope it, and I wanted to make sure everybody understood something else too. We have an existing 12-acre lot. It is substantially trees.
Microphone.
Sorry, we have an existing 12-acre lot. There's a lot of trees, right? There's an area in the middle that's grassy. There's the house, the stables, the greenhouse. So that lot, as it exists, has a particular permeability, right? So when the rain comes, it hits the lot, and that lot has the capacity to hold water. So it's kind of like, you know, big old 12 acres of holding capacity. When this lot's redeveloped, that holding capacity changes substantially because now you have homes with basements, and those basements are probably going to be pretty deep, right? This is Glencoe, 9-foot, 10-foot deep basin. So now you've removed a substantial portion of the land that had been there before that had a specific holding capacity. You've also paved a lot of the, right? There's patios, there's sidewalks, there's roads. So now what we're talking about, when you talk about the fact that there's overland flow now, and they're going to do all these improvements, are going to be better. Well, if this system fails, the water that can come into my neighborhood now is substantially more because we have substantially changed the holding capacity of the existing property. So you can't say that they go in, they cut down the trees, they pave things over, they build houses and basements, that in any case, no matter what happens, it's going to be better than it was before or something. I don't exactly remember how you said that. So we have to make sure we understand there's a pre-development rain flow situation and a post-development situation, okay? And so we have to be really careful when we talk about these things because I feel like we mix them up and when we talk about before the development and after the development. So you've changed substantially the holding capacity of the property itself upon development. So I want to make sure that that's clear to everybody. Okay, so that was what I wanted to talk about rain. And also, I think we all know, and as someone else said, right, the amount of rain we get just keeps on going up. And the developers' lawyers in the last, in the document that was sent out on Friday had said it wasn't fair that they were being asked to be held to 2019 standards. And I found that to be, I don't know what the right word is, but a terrible thing to say, right? How can they say that it's fair that they should build something based on 1989 rainfall data? So I appreciate that the Plan Commission has recommended that they use the up-to-date data because clearly the developer's pushing back on that. Irregardless of rainfall, that was what I want to start out with because I think we need to clarify a few things from what Rick said. I wanted to talk a little bit about the 12 standards that have been published by the Village of Glencoe for developments in our community. And one of the things that I thought was surprising in the document that was published on Friday was that apparently the 12 standards don't count. So what it said was we have some standards that are real standards and some standards that are just subjective. And I thought that that was surprising. And I don't understand how those categories are determined. And it also was not clear which categories are considered to be absolute or real standards and which ones are ones that we don't really care about. So that's one question I have for the Planning Commission. Yeah, it's in the report from the village.
I think it's in the cover letter from
Cover letter.
Lee Brown, or in the, maybe in the memorandum. What?
There's a memorandum, I think that's from the
One,
village.
one example would be,
Yeah, the memorandum to Bruce
if
and
you,
David.
yeah, one example would be that one standard says that it will not increase stormwater runoff to a neighboring property. Well, that standard is even superseded by the various regulations which require a reduction in runoff. So finding that standard doesn't really get us very much. So that was one example. Other standards have a more subjective
Yeah. So I think it would
ambiance.
be really helpful for the Plan Commission to define which standards they actually are going to hold this proposal to and which ones they don't care about. Because it doesn't make sense to me that we have standards that we don't adhere to.
If I could read them, it doesn't actually say these don't count.
Well, it says-
While others are more subjective standards, they may be measured by degrees of
Oh,
compliance.
okay. I'm sorry, you're correct. You're correct. Yeah, so when I read that, I thought, I don't really understand. So then when we talk about that and we look at what the 12 conditions are, one is that, okay, so this is number 3. The subdivision will accommodate development on a lot that will comply with required setbacks. And I understand that that's the way this has been designed and will not result in a substantial loss of existing trees. So this development, as it's planned right now, will result in the loss of 51% of the heritage trees on the site. It's approximately 140 heritage trees. So a heritage tree is defined as a tree that's not a junk tree. It doesn't count, a buckthorn's not a heritage tree, a linden, a Norway maple, stuff that we don't want, right, in our yards. A heritage tree are things like, and I have a list. So this is just from Lot 1. So in Lot 1, the trees that will be destroyed by the home being built on Lot 1 include 10 mature oaks. So, and these trees range in size. There's one little one that's only 8 inches in circumference. The other ones range.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you for this. I can see where that standard is incredibly confusing because it says substantial number of trees. It doesn't give us the option of saying no development. So in other words, it's a substantial number of trees. It means that the developer has to be careful and creative, and in fact what they do is they work in conjunction with our own staff to come up with placement of the various utilities, homes, et cetera, to reduce as much as possible the number of trees that are damaged. It's not an arithmetic issue as you're suggesting.
Well, I'm just reading what I can see. It says substantial. And I would also add that, so I've lived in Glencoe for 17 years, and I know lots of people who own homes, and when we were talking about this with some friends, my one friend said, "That's so crazy. I asked the village if I could build a garage beside my home that I've owned for 20 years, and they said no, because I was going to cut down one heritage tree." And I talked to somebody else, and they said, yeah, I was building a house on Bluff, and I wanted to move my house out like 2 feet. And the Planning Commission said, no, because you're going to damage a heritage
once
tree.
again, I am so sorry, but we can't.
Think about it.
There's no way we can discuss all, well, I will let you, but let me say first, there's no way that we can sit here tonight and discuss all of the provisions that are in our various codes and ordinances and their applicability to individuals.
Right, no, I'm just saying
outside of
as
this
an
room.
example, and these are anecdotes, and I understand. So what I don't understand is if a village resident who's a taxpayer in Glencoe asks to make a modification to their house and it's rejected because one heritage tree is lost, how can a developer come in and say,
We don't know all
140
the
trees.
facts in that instance.
Okay.
So let me.
I
let
think
me-
there's probably a lot of people here who probably had similar issues, but I want to say too as well. Okay.
I didn't have that situation.
So I've taken a look at the drawings and where all the trees are, and there are ways that the developer could, so there's certain portions of the property in which there are more heritage trees than others. There are ways, I think, that the developer could be creative and look at changing the way that they've laid out this property. And it's offensive to me that as a community that says that we have a mission towards sustainability, that we can just give a green light to a project in which we are cutting down 140 oak trees. I mean, did anybody watch Greta Thunberg on Friday? Did anybody? So
I'd like to.
I want to finish this.
No,
because-
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
This
I'm
is
cutting you
ridiculous.
off. No, because there are a lot of other people here. You're not the only other. You're not the only other person. No. Wait.
May I
Please.
comment as
No.
well?
Listen. There have to be rules here. We have to have a civilized debate.
Yes, there have to be rules.
So I
So the rules are
told you there
there
would be a limit. I
12
told you there would be a
standards.
limit for discussion, and I have other people here who have
So I'd
other
like-
questions.
So I'd like,
No.
so
I'm
Bruce,
sorry. I'm sorry. Listen.
Bruce.
You have to listen. There have to be rules. When we set rules,
That's great that there are rules. There are rules.
there have to
okay?
be limitations on how long we discuss. You have to give us a chance to get out of this. You have to. Sit down for a minute.
I'd like to propose to the bill. I'd like to propose the planning commission. So what I've heard tonight multiple times is, gosh, we've had 3 meetings already. We had to stay till midnight last time. And this kind of thing. Okay, do you understand? This is 29 homes. You are talking about the last major tractor
And
plant in
we do
Glencoe.
understand that.
I think,
We-
I don't think you're listening, Bruce. You were rude and dismissive to Rick when he talked about his concerns, and now you're being rude and dismissive
No,
to
I'm
me. and I
trying to
don't
maintain
appreciate
order
it.
in a meeting because we have other people besides you to talk.
Well, we can all listen. We had to.
Not if you won't sit down.
The first meeting that I went to, the developer had over an hour to speak. He talked about
But-
trivia,
but-
like what height the kitchen
Has anyone
sinks
here
would
on the
be,
commission
and all-
learned
there were-
anything about the loss of trees that they didn't know already before Ann started talking? Is there anybody here that's learning any new information? I mean, look at your audience. We're here, we're residents. We're
You're
going to
not
leave here,
listening,
we're
Bruce.
going to go, to the same establishments you do.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I didn't really learn anything new about the trees, but your comment regarding other options and ways to develop the site, perhaps some clustering, is not permitted in our subdivision ordinance as it stands today. I think it's a very creative way. I've seen a lot of developments done that way, which would allow clusterings, perhaps. Unfortunately, we're handcuffed there, and the ordinance may need to be revisited, and that would be a great thing for you guys to bring to the village if this gets to the village, and you can present the argument there that maybe that needs to be revisited, and perhaps that can be something that can be done. But at this point, I mean, your comments are well intended, and we appreciate your efforts and your comments, but you're passionate, and I appreciate that, but what you're bringing up has been talked about and discussed and vetted, and we really have done a very deep dive into this preliminary plat, which is really very unusual. I think they've been very accommodating. I think a lot of people have listened. I think that the recommendations by staff have been very, very are well intended, and they're taking the recommendation that you want, so they will raise the standard for the water retention to meet the current standards as proposed in the new May 19, and as your husband articulated. But we need to wait and see what the engineering is, and that's going to be part of the final plat. And when that comes out, then the deep dive really happens.
So I guess what we're asking for is not to wait for that deep dive to happen, but to take the deep dive before you move this forward any further. Because there's so many, it's a really complicated project.
We understand that
And
that's...
you're not, I don't feel like you're, why can't we do the deep dive now?
Well, I will try and answer that, but, and I'm sorry, Rick, if I offended you. It's not, it's not my manner or style to try and do that. the standard I think we have is that as a preliminary recommendation, we have to decide whether it's feasible to solve these problems, whether there's a reasonable basis to say that they can be solved. And I thought I heard Rick say at the end, yes, they can be, that what we're disagreeing about is whether we should solve them right now, today, or later. Our ordinance, the laws that we're sworn to uphold, say that when the applicant demonstrates the level that they've demonstrated to date, that it's reasonable that they can solve these problems and that they comply with the requirements otherwise for lot size and lot area, they're entitled to get at least the courtesy of a preliminary consideration and a recommendation so that they can then invest the money to go forward. So if the disagreement is simply that don't even consider it at all until they produce final, it's simply not in keeping with our ordinances. It's not what we're charged with doing here. It would be making a special exception of one owner. It's not how we treat anybody else in the village.
I think the reason we're asking for an exception is because it's an exceptional project.
But
So this is not like building one house.
right, we
And
understand.
I think you also have to understand, for those of us who have lived through extreme flooding events, which we have all lived through multiple times, to have these engineering drawings not address very real concerns about stormwater retention and detention. And another detail was the lawyer said that there was a question about mosquito control, right? The lawyer in the last document said these will not be retention basins.
They're-
Okay? So do you know that the WMO requires both retention and detention basins?
I've seen that, and it's confusing, but
It is confusing,
I
Bruce,
think
which is why
we can't.
the devil is in the details, right?
Right.
So you need to consider the details.
But no one
before
up
you-
here, I don't think, is agreeing with that position. But we understand that that's your position. We just believe that we have a duty, because we have sworn to follow the laws and ordinances of the village, to act on a preliminary plan when it's appropriate to. And for example, if there's no way for the water to get to the northeast basin through all of that because of the elevation, it won't get approved. It'll come back here. They'll have to revise things. It won't get approved.
Yeah,
But for us to think that all of the engineering talent that we have, that we've relied on, and that the applicant is investing money, that everyone is investing money, and that they're actually clueless about how the water would get down there, and they actually have no idea that it would ever work, it doesn't make sense. I can't speak for the rest of the commission, but it seems to me that it's a problem that can be solved, and if they're willing to risk the time and effort to solve it, let them try and solve it, and if they can't, I'm sure that Marty and Dave Mao and everyone will say they haven't solved it. But to say they have to solve it before we even act, I don't think is fair to them under our ordinances. But that's my position. We'll find out what the rest of the commission thinks.
Thank you for your time. And what I would hope then, when we get to that next stage, if that's what the Plan Commission decides, that there be a very in-depth review of these engineering drawings, because so far they have not met with even. They're not correct, and there's errors. And I think to show a document in which a detention pond basically floods the houses that it's adjacent to shows poor engineering choices. And I'm a chemical engineer. I work on my work is I work on the development of major, much bigger projects and much more technically complex projects than this. And this would be the kind of thing that would be a red flag. If my client went to their board and asked for investment in a project like this and they had those kinds of errors in the drawings, it would get thrown out, it would get thrown back, and it would get redone. And I don't understand why a similar standard isn't being held here. Why we say, hey, yeah, that's okay, let's go forward with this, and there's mistakes in it. That's the part I don't understand, and I think that's what Rick was trying to get at, and that's what I'm hoping to impart to the Plan Commission, is that I feel like it's a little bit like if there's a mistake, it'll get fixed, but if there's a mistake, my house floods. And for those of you who have been through a house flood, it's a terrible event to happen. So this is not just oh gosh, there'll be a little overland flow. There's a whole community of people whose homes are going to flood. And that's really serious.
All right.
And the developer's been cavalier about this position. their choice to use 30-year-old rainfall curves shows that they have not shown
But
an
can I just
interest in
pop in a quick
protecting our
analogy?
homes. That's
Sorry,
the concern I
I'm
really
really
have.
appreciative of all the thought that's gone into this, and one of the things I love about Glencoe is the diversity of thought and backgrounds and depth of experience, and you've demonstrated that. I guess my expertise is in business and projects, and the way it works in my neck of the woods is you pitch something, you obviously have to put a fair amount of thought into a project, and then you go to leadership and say, here's what we're thinking of doing, does this make sense? And you either get a yes, go and figure it all out and come back with a final proposal, or a no. And my view on this process is that we're doing the yes, this makes sense, go and figure it out, but there's still the final step, not only at the Plan Commission, but also at the Village Board.
Yes,
I'd al-
yes.
I'd
That's
also-
why I work in that kind of environment
I'd also
as
like
well,
to
and
add
we
a-
would- this would have been thrown out.
I'd also like to add a comment. The interpretation of what's on the drawings is not necessarily a mistake in your vocabulary. It's, what I'm hearing is that it may be a poor choice in your mind, but it's, in my opinion, it's not necessarily a mistake. It's not a calculation mistake. I'm not quite done. I come from a background of working on very large projects. I'm an architect. And it's quite common to do enough work early on so that people are comfortable in where the direction of the project is headed. But when you ask 3 months into the project, what's the design of the foundation, there's a general sense of what it is, but it would be irresponsible for any engineer to tell you this is what the rebar needs to be in the foundation, right? So we're 3 months into this project. I am taking on faith, given the expertise that I've heard, that there is a way to solve the pressing problems of drainage and so on. And as what was just mentioned, if it can't be, then the thing fails, and we're hearing from them again. Frankly, if the detention basins need to get larger, so be it, and the impact on the architecture, so be it. They're the ones responsible to draw the plat. They're the ones responsible for the pro forma. We are trying to enforce the village code and good design in general. I will say that the codes in general are a minimum for good design. You have to follow the code, you must, that's law, but in general, that's a minimum. And I think that is a pretty much understood tenet within the profession. Okay, so I think some of the things you've said tonight are of concern for sure for you and for us, but I want you to understand we are listening, and some of the ways that you phrased it I wish you could try that again, please, because you're talking to some people here who have spent a lot of time looking at this because we are worried about it as you are. Okay? I want you to understand that. I counted trees just like you did.
Thank you.
Every
Peter.
single one.
Yeah, I thank you for that. And I just want to make sure you understand, we're not 3 months in, right? This project, they're according to the lawyer's comments, I believe they started talking to the village engineers in December or January. So we're 9 months plus in, and I think that's part of our concern. If we're at 9 months and we're still at this point,
What's the time frame to get to a final plat agreement?
Under the code, you have 12 months from the approval of preliminary to final, at that point, to submission. Yeah, so, and that, at that point, if you fail, you either go back to preliminary or, I can't recall if we have an extension, but the expectation is that there are up to 12 months, and projects often do take that amount of time.
So
All right.
there's another year to go.
okay. Oh, great. Another year in meetings.
All right, can we,
Thank you for your consideration.
can we move on?
Kathleen O'Halloran, thank you, and really thank you to all of you. We know that you are all working hard, and I really feel like we are all in this together as a village, and that's why we're here, because we love Glencoe and we all care, whether it's like residents and commissioners and all of our friends. So what I wanted to propose to the commission is, I find it, so fascinating that you have these A and B as these two options, A or B, regarding the hydraulic or the new WMO standards. And what I wanted to say was, I'm so thrilled because Dave Mao, who I know well because he's been out to my house on Terrace Court. I actually live right in front of the Terrace Court space, and it connects to my house. So this is a very personal issue to me, as well as just concern about the community. Dave Mao is on board. Like, we need to adhere to the WMO standards. He has said that. Marty Michalesco, and you guys know I wrote this in a letter, so thank you for taking the time. I do have new information to present. Commissioner Miller, Commissioner Miller and Commissioner Mukherjee, who's not here tonight, is that correct?
Right.
He also, was on record saying we need to adhere to these standards, and all of you have put that in the minutes as one of your conditions, which we applaud, because for us that is like kind of main issue number one, So what I would like you guys to think about, and I'm hoping that you can actually deliberate on this before you make a decision tonight, is that you have A, which is this hydraulic pipe. You have or B, which is the WMO standards. Based on what I've seen and based on your recommendations, you guys already strongly believe that the developers should be held to those standards. So what I'm saying is, why don't we have A and B? Instead of an or in the language tonight, perhaps we can have an and. And I think everyone, like as you just said, Commissioner Huvard, we don't want this to happen. We don't want you to get damaged. We don't want you to flood. Well, if it does flood, it's going to flood right in front of my home. And I could certainly rest assured knowing that you're guaranteeing through various measures to ensure that the Terrace Court Basin does not flood. And I know that's what we all want. So what I'm requesting is that, like, in your deliberations tonight, please think about voting for A and B, not or, and let's provide greater assurance and safety and concern for all of us. I think that is something that you guys are offering, and it's something that I think would make all of us feel better. Because I think ultimately there's a win-win here, and I respect and value Ann and Rick and everyone who is here. We're all here, you guys, only because of anxiety and stress from what we have dealt with. So none of us really are coming from a position of wanting to be, not be respectful or whatever. And same with you in regard to them. We are all here because we have great concern and passion and love for this town, for this community celebrating its sesquicentennial, it's always hard to pronounce that, this year. Let's that's what we all want, we know you want. So please consider taking these ideas and this suggestion into consideration tonight. And please, consider saying, if you go for yes, please have it with that type of consideration so that the village of Glencoe and the board knows that that's what you want. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sheila Weimer? Sorry. Weimer, sorry.
Sheila Weimer, 23-year resident. I agree with everything Eileen said. My other thing that came up tonight was the talk Commissioner Solon brought up about the monument sign. I don't know of a single place in Glencoe that has one. I think you should recommend that the sign go through approval, and maybe not a monument, something like the Skokie Ridge, but anything more than that is really not, I think, in character of this town, and serves nothing more than a marketing tool for the developer. And it's in a very high traffic area, and I just don't like the thought of that. Thank you.
Thank you.
On the back is Daryl Brayboy.
Thank you for your time. I think this might be easier. Yeah. So I want to thank all the commissioners, planning, development team, the staff, and their hard work and effort. I really do appreciate the language you put out there tonight. I feel like we're being heard. But sanctioning Rick and Ann's comments and my wife Eileen's comments, I don't know how many of you, hands up, have ever flooded. Basement property, right? So you know what this is. Developers, how many? Flooded. All right. Now we're all one team. Let's get this fixed. figure it out, and let's do this together. So I will bring the champagne, guys. And my friend Mark Schwartz said to say hi. Okay? This is a team effort. So help me to understand, whenever you vote to give green light for phase 1, it goes to the village board next. So as this whole design element is being figured out, calculations and so forth, does it come back here? Aha! More party time. I'm so excited. I'm getting to know more of you all the time. So I just have a couple quick questions, and I'm hoping Dave can help me on this. So to whatever design that becomes the perfected design, like Eileen said, why not A and B? I didn't think about that, but I love that idea. A plus B equals C. But how about, Dave, you mentioned earlier the pass-through from the southeast basin into the terrace court system. Right now, between Paul and Ann's house, we have the Kelly Lane sewer, which is an 8-inch, which is an 8-inch diameter pipe connecting through. Does that need to be expanded to handle the flow rate coming out of the southeast basin as its preliminary design has been shown?
That's yet to be confirmed.
Okay. So because we are at ground zero of the terrace court basin, if that system becomes too overcharged because of maybe the ultimate design is perfect, but we never know what Mother Nature may throw at us in the years ahead. Let's say there is some deficiencies, like what we've experienced over 20 years. We just invested $100,000 to engineer a giant swale, carving our whole side of our home, to connect to an 18-inch culvert that Dave was engineering, to connect to the storm sewer. But what we discovered is it's not straight through. There's a check valve, so we become a detention pond. If for some unforeseen, as Dave and I have discussed, future storm that's greater than the system can handle, that check valve has to close so the overflow doesn't come back onto our property, and then we become another detention pond until the overcharge decreases, and then the check valve opens and we can discharge that water. So that leaves us at a potential future threat. So I'm just trying to understand, even with the perfected design, at what point in the future, if the greater output from Hoover overcharges the terrace court basin, causing more increased flooding and to our own home, who's responsible? Do we get to chase down the developing team? Do we come back to the village? Do we come back to you guys, to the village board, streets and sanitation? I'm just trying to think a little bit ahead, because having lived through sandbags and pumps for many years, I just don't want to have to ever go back there. And I also want to have the future potential to sell my house for a profit, not for a loss, because of unexpected, water coming back at us because of inefficient design. Those are only my questions. And that's all I wanted to ask.
Thank you.
But is there an answer? I mean, that's the question. I'm asking the question, is there an answer to who becomes responsible? If in fact, through all the work, all the design headaches, all of the time you guys have put in, village board, the staff and so forth, their designing team, who's left responsible if the terrace courts basin once again starts experiencing increased storm effects and flooding that is highly contributed by the Hoover project? That's what I'm kind of still left with.
But everyone
every night.
says the Hoover project is already flooding them. I mean, the Hoover site is already contributing to flooding.
Because it's not our, we worked with the village in 2016, which we're so grateful for, put in new infrastructure, thanks to Dave Mom, Phil Crawley, and everyone else, and the village told us, you need to
Right.
put in this swale, and those two things, no more flooding.
Well-
So we just did that improvement, and so that's, we are doing well.
Good.
So thank you.
Good.
Thank you to everybody, that's, that's
So-
why, we haven't slept in 20 years, and now we want,
This piece of quiet.
We wanna sleep again.
if
It's a personal issue, but it does speak to just what is going on, and maybe.
Right.
We just want, you just said, Bruce, we don't want that to happen.
we don't.
So
We
how
don't.
can we assure,
Well-
can you guarantee that it won't happen and that we're not gonna flood again?
I think that the design people use every means of intelligence and creativity to design a system that relies on passive means, that has all kinds of safety defaults and valves. I mean, if there's ultimately a failure, is it a failure because of an act of God? Is it a failure because the system didn't really work as designed? Is it a failure because the system wasn't maintained? You know, I can't answer that question. And how, I mean, those are complex issues. I don't know who ultimately, you know, most of the risk is passed on to insurance companies ultimately in one way or another, and they argue about who should pick up the liability, but that's not what we want to see happen.
We understand that, but I'm just saying, I'm hoping we're not back here in another 5 to 8 years after this whole development is in. We've got increased rainfall coming, and we're seeing, well, this design quite isn't holding up. We come back to the board asking for relief.
I would be horrified too if that happened. I would be, and you know, we've had conversations with staff where I've probably asked them questions and is pointed, and I didn't mean to be rude. I really am sorry if I was, but I've asked the same kind of questions, and I think most of the commissioners here have also, in the same way, because we all want that outcome as well, the same outcome as you do.
Okay. Thank you for your time.
Okay. That's all of the comment.
There might be some on the back, sorry.
Well, but go ahead. I mean, my 30 minutes became an hour and 10 minutes.
It's getting closer.
The question I have for you is, other than swaying us to make a good decision, is there something you really want us to consider before we vote?
There is. So, again, good evening. Resident of 1178 Carroll Lane. I've been here before. If you recall, I'm the Canadian. So, you know, I moved here, and I've been here about 8 months now. What I want to say is thank you very much. What I've heard today definitely, I would say, is very motivating. I had questions that I sent to Dave Mel, and thankfully the recommendations or conditions that were put up addressed most of them. There are still some, which is why I'm up here, which I would like to share with you. The first one I have is really around, so the stormwater condition, I think it was subsection 2, I was up there, about the petitioner basically applying for an easement. So my question is, how do we envision this happen? And what happens if they cannot get that approval? And secondly, if they cannot get approval for option A, which is to take it to the north. So it's neither A or B. So what happens in that case, based on what we put up? I'm not asking for an answer, I'm just saying think about it, because we're talking about...
This is a conditional approval.
Right.
So if
No, I'm
they
just...
don't get those conditions,
Okay.
they would have to go back to the drawing.
Just saying.
Just self-actuate.
Exactly.
Nothing has to happen.
Okay. Just saying, think ahead. Second was setback on this, the detention basin from adjacent properties. I'm still not familiar with it, so maybe I just need to be educated. My property is one that borders the southwest or the southeastern one, as we've talked about. I'd like to understand what that looks like. As Rick mentioned, there's going to be an overflow and that kind of design. I'd just like to know what that setback looks like. So I'm not looking for an answer, just kind of talking about the question. Next one is about the terrace court basin capacity. Not once have I heard somebody talk about, when we do move forward, what kind of study are we doing here? We keep talking about, we'll tie into it. There was an upgrade that was done in 2016. You know, we know that the rainfall and bulletins and everything was done, but nobody's gone back and looked at the analysis that was done, compared it to bulletin 70 or even the strictest of, I would say, kind of rainfall events that are yet to come. But yet we're talking about tying into it. I understand work will be done, but at this point we should be, you know, start talking about studies and things that we should do. Because somebody talked about, well, it's going to basically reduce 80% of the flow across, evenly across the adjacent properties. How do I know that? I'm one of the properties there. And by the way, they want to tie into the terrace court basin. How do I know this capacity? These are fundamental things that we should be thinking about. I understand it's conditional, but I would just ask that we think about that before we start talking about tying into the terrace court basin. And then there were two other questions I had last time, which, you know, didn't get answered. So you mentioned this. One was, you know, really around the development, build out, and phasing that will go on and with the construction. Again, you know, I'm adjacent to that. If it's going to be 3 years, as we talked about, I'd like to know about it. I mean, the amount of construction, pollution, and a bunch of other things that will happen, noise, dust. My son is asthmatic, okay? I have to border that. So if he's not going to be able to play out there for 3 years, I would like them to take as much measures as they can with whatever draping, containment that they do when they build, to be able to make sure that the air quality does not degrade beyond a certain, I would say, kind of acceptable limit. We haven't talked about that. These are people's lives, real lives. We have to live through this. So it's not about, great, we just approve it, gets the final and we approve it. There are things that we need to, there are details which folks here have talked about that we need to ensure that we think about. You don't know that my son is asthmatic? I know it. I have to deal with it. And this past weekend, he doesn't only have asthma, he has food allergies. We had to call 911. So I'm happy to see, again in your design, that you talked about that emergency access. Because when I saw that plan, I thought it was very, very stupid to have one access point for 29 homes that was a loop around. If you have kids there with allergies and whatnot that have emergency vehicles come in, I looked at that and said, I wouldn't buy a house in that subdivision. Knowing what I have to deal with in the middle of the night, waking up and deal with as a parent. So these are just details that I'm just saying we need to think about. And frankly, again, very encouraged by what I saw, because a lot of questions I sent to Dave were in those conditions, but there's still work to be done. And I think, I appreciate that you guys are listening, because definitely I see that. But we shouldn't take the foot off the pedal, and we shouldn't lose sight of the details. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Mike Bolin. I live at 1163 Green Bay. I actually had the largest border on the contiguous to the property because they have a long fence, about 285 feet. And anyway, that's not my concern. My concern is the traffic study. And I see the developer has a traffic study. Do we have a traffic study independent of that? I don't think so. The developer is an advocate, hired an advocate for the traffic study. And he says everything's fine according to their plan. Well, the plans we've seen basically are interdirected. They talk about how nice the development's going to be inside, and you have fences and this, that, and the other thing. But the egress is going to be out onto Green Bay Road, then they're going to change what Wesley Road into a four-way intersection. Now, there's only one four-way intersection in Glencoe, and that's in downtown Glencoe. That's the only one. All the rest of the streets leading to Green Bay are T intersections. Now, I'm no expert on traffic or anything else. But the developer, the petitioner, does have an expert. I think we should have an expert. There used to be a place called the Traffic Institute at Northwestern University. It no longer exists, but I called them up today, and it's got a new name. It's called pardon me, getting stuck in here. Department of Public Safety, and the director, they do studies on whether the traffic flow is good or not. I think I was shocked at the development when I saw it. First off, as the last gentleman said, there's only one entrance. Well, in emergency situations, it seems that the development is pitched towards an older type community, and they're going to have trouble getting the ambulances in and out. For the older, they have a hard time getting the ambulances in and out of my driveway with me and my wife. We're in bad shape. But no, it's true. It's like they stop all the time, and they're very good, by the way, very courteous. But that's going to be a big problem. The other thing he talks about is snow removal. If you want to have one exit and he's locked up with it, we do get snow in Chicago, okay? I don't know what you're going to do with the water when it freezes, by the way. and it rains on top of that ice, you're gonna get a lot of flooding anyway. But that's, we talked about water all night, and I think that's a bigger concern than anything else. It really adversely affects the property. I'm concerned about the traffic. There's people, a lot of people who work for homes, like cleaning people and that sort of stuff. And the intersection there with Wesley Road, there is a marked crosswalk there, but it's a big distance across the road. And those people, you know, in the winter, they're not too fast, okay? The traffic coming south, that is pretty fast. So there also is the diagram that we saw from the developer showed the big entrance to the property, which is attractive and if it were in a vacuum, but it did not show the bus stops. The bus stops, there's one on the east side, there's one on the west side. And what are you going to do with those? Are dedicated bus stops. And those people rely on that, and they do cross Green Bay Road. The other thing too, if you paint Green Bay Road with lanes, what do you do in the winter when there's ice on it and snow on it? You can't see the paint, for God's sakes. The road, that's what they're counting on, paint to regulate traffic control. That's silly. It just doesn't work. Well, the plan I heard last time would be to take the eastbound Wesley Road, to take a nick off the north side of the Wesley Road to make it even larger, to make it into a four-way intersection. I believe a four-way intersection is undesirable. But my thoughts are not so good. I think we ought to do, I'd recommend to the board, contact the Northwestern University and get a traffic study done for the safety aspect alone. The thing is, the plats you see are two-dimensional. The roads are three-dimensional. We're going from south to north. It's quite a rise. It's a steady rise, and there's a curve. It makes it a blind curve. Coming south, the same thing. It's even more dramatic on the terms of your limited site. Then it also, I noticed one of the things in the petitioner's traffic study, a discussion about the bus turnaround. But it says basically dodge the bus, okay? And that's the solution to the problem. I don't think that's a good idea, to dodge the bus or wait for the bus. I see people ignoring the bus traffic, and that's the way people get killed. We have, you know, it's the school bus rule about the sign coming out and you stop, and that's supposed to protect the children. That's ignored regularly around this town, okay? And they shouldn't, but it is. The police do stop them when they see them. But again, I think we need a traffic study, and I urge us to have that.
Thank you.
Just one quick thing that Glencoe and Park Place, I noticed now we've suffered a lot of flooding on Park Place. We've suffered a lot of flooding on Park Place. It has been alleviated a lot with the 216 renovation. However, I am a real estate broker, and something's been brought to my attention that I don't know if you guys know or other people know. Within the New Trier district, 1,100 homes are now on the FEMA flood plan, have been added to the FEMA flood plan, some in Glencoe and some in other areas of the New Trier Township. I called up the tax assessor's office to corroborate it, spoke to the tax assessor, and yes, and the reasons are some were left out of the last plan, others are there because of increase in rain and development, and some homes are in Glencoe. So there is an increase of weather and rain, and I don't want to be in an area now that we're going to be in a flood plain. Just something that I didn't know anyone knew, and others may not have known. Just wanted to bring that up.
Just Mr. Chairman, just a point of clarification that the only properties in Glencoe that are in the floodplain are on the western border along the golf courses on the east diversion ditch. Just a handful of residential backyards.
There are no structures that are in the floodplain, just for clarification.
Okay, thank you all. So I asked my fellow plan commissioners, how should we begin? We have a draft recommendation, we have draft conditions. Peter had suggested adding a condition. We've had some comments, some of which might suggest. Well, if I guess I'm going to look at the applicant to say if they have any desire at all to speak. I give them 15 and a half seconds.
I move it be incorporated. Oh, sorry.
I'll take 15 and a half seconds. First of all, I want to say thank you to the commission, to the staff, the consultants, and all the members of the public for the amount of time that you've devoted to this. I said at the last meeting that I believe after doing this for many years that these difficult projects actually provide the opportunity to make things better for the existing residents. I think you've heard testimony over the course of this proceeding, which has not just involved these 3 meetings, but also, as you know, we had a neighborhood meeting. I do think you've received facts and information that can make things, that this project will actually make things better, most notably in terms of stormwater management and traffic conditions for the existing residents, and the improvements that were built in 2016. So, I do want to say thank you to all of you for the amount of time you've devoted to this matter. In terms of the conditions, I just want to note for the record that, we understand and have no significant problems with any of the conditions, but we would, again, like to note for the record, obviously you can come to your own conclusions, but we still disagree with the concept of the need for the emergency access drive. We're only talking about 28 homes here. I can show you subdivisions that have survived on the North Shore with far more homes and only one access and have existed for decades with no problem. We think it will result in needless extra pavement, needless loss of trees, and as we said in our presentation response materials to you, we think it creates, if not an actual, at least a perceived threat to safety for not just the residents, future residents of this subdivision, but also Northwood Drive. But again, you should make your recommendation as you see fit. We feel the same way about the pedestrian access. There's some others that we continue to disagree with. Having to have sidewalks on both sides of a small subdivision like this. I mean, it's no different than reducing the width of the pavement we're proposing here. Modern planning, I understand that, the old-fashioned 66-foot wide right-of-way, which the suburbs inherited from the city of Chicago, where you have 4 lanes of 12-foot wide traffic, curb, gutter, parking on both sides, sidewalks on both sides. It's in a development like this, and again, I could show you communities all over the North Shore, and I'm sure Mr. Brown's, firm has worked on plenty of these that only have one sidewalk on one side. It saves impervious area, it saves trees. You should recommend, as you recommend, we continue to believe sidewalks on both sides are not needed in a small subdivision like this. I would say those are our major concerns, but generally we have no problem with the conditions that are proposed. Thank you.
So one way we can proceed is to see if there is a motion to adopt the recommendation with...
Can I say one more thing I meant to say? The comment was made about by IO about the 2 conditions. I just want to note for the record, I thought it would give you some level of comfort that we have an agreement in principle with one owner for that connection, and I thought you should know that before you vote.
Okay. So one thought is to see if anyone would like to move that we adopt the recommendation report to the village board with the conditions as stated, and then if we have a second, we can have amendments to those conditions, we can discuss them further, or we can, if you think there's enough that we need to discuss before anyone can make a motion, we can step back for a second and look at any of the individual conditions. But, from just standard rules, Robert rules, we'd start with a motion and a second and see if we can't get some discussion going.
Do we incorporate Peter's before or after that?
Well, I'll let Stu answer that. I think,
Depends on the motion.
Well, you have that written before you, so since you all have that text written, you could do a motion stating that you would like to adopt the report and recommendations with the inclusion of draft condition number 10, because it slots in nicely.
I have a question conceptually about the suggestion that was made by one of the nearby residents about instead of A or B, doing A and B. Does that work conceptually? I was having trouble picturing it. Dave, maybe you can speak to that.
We don't have final engineering, so we don't know what the elevation of the balancing pipe would be. It is very probable that the additional area necessary to meet the Bulletin 70 standard would not ever be used because the water's going to flow through that balancing pipe before it would get to the, but we don't know that. I think if the developer has a choice, they would build the lesser of the two costly parts of it, which is the Bulletin 70 standard, and we'd lose the potential additional capacity that is built into this balancing proposal.
what if we were to say and or B, whichever is most advantageous to the village residents? Because we don't know what the final design is going to do, and it may be that it's a combination of those. It may be, that provides the greatest protection against flooding.
In whose determination?
The village board, of course.
I think that's a little bit of a subjective standard, and I think that it's. I guess you could put in the determination that provides the greatest amount of protection to the village board in the determination of the village board, and they can determine if they want to adopt that condition or if they want to look to staff to concretize that a little bit more.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, isn't it the staff's position today, though, that they prefer the equalizing pipe design over additional compensatory storage, on-site wet storage?
Yes.
Because that would, in their opinion, that would bring a greater benefit to the community, so it's already kind of been somewhat decided. Is that fair to say?
Well, again, it's dependent upon the acceptance of that engineering study by the forest preserves accepting the stormwater.
I guess the condition already says A, unless it can't be done, and then B. Is that what it says?
Yes.
No, it doesn't?
Yes, let's just clarify that. It does,
Doesn't state that A is better than B.
but it does say that we do A first, and unless it can't be done, then we implement B, doesn't it?
Well,
I
I'm
don't
not
read
sure
it
that
that
those
way.
words are phrased that way, but you could.
But it does say either or,
Well-
but I think it says it must incorporate one of them, so it does allow for both. It doesn't preclude both. So if the
Well, then,
village decides-
what we really meant to say here is that we should
Preferred
incorporate A if
first.
allowed, if we can work it out preferably, and then if not,
Yeah.
it should incorporate B. That's really what we were saying then.
So
That would be the staff's recommendation.
So should we change it?
Maybe we can say
Must
I think that's good. I can
incorporate
support that.
A.
preferred A.
Take either out?
So,
But this is a report to the board, and you can annotate this so that they better understand your intent.
We can't.
Well, we can, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
we can, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so why don't we say must incorporate, and then just say a gravity-fed blah, 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 or in the event A cannot be
Or in the event A
accomplished.
cannot be accomplished.
So So do we motion for that change, or do we just change it?
Do we actually have a motion?
We don't.
We don't have a motion
We don't have a
yet.
motion.
Yeah, so
Okay.
one of the things that you could do, yeah, just procedurally you could do, is you could make a motion to accept this report with the inclusion of the draft condition 10. Once that's seconded, then you can propose various amendments, and that may be, I don't think you're going to go through each one of these, I hope. But if you do, it might be a good thing to then go and adopt amendments throughout that, because that helps us keep track as well. So,
On the basis of motions at the time.
May I, but you've said that we don't need one of these conditions, right? We don't need C4, which was the gateway. You said that no longer applies because the plan has taken that out, so maybe we could move. C4, page 4 in mine.
C4?
Yeah.
On the public rights of way.
You said that we don't need the part that, with the exception of the sidewalk, because you said they took that out.
Have they removed the gate
They
from
have
the
removed-
drawings?
The drawings we've seen, they have removed the gate.
Right, so if that's the case, then is the preliminary plat that they have you submitted without the gate? So we don't need this one anymore.
yes.
Right.
Yes, so in the primary motion, you can add draft condition 10 regarding the, what are they, the pillars, the caryatids, the women holding up the world? Yes, okay, and then remove condition C sub Romanet 4.
And while we're at it, just include and amend condition A1 to provide, incorporate A or B in the event A cannot be accomplished, stormwater detention at Bulletin 70.
So long as there's consensus on that and someone can make that motion?
Can I just wait? Could we start with the motion?
That's not my place, but that's kind of my whole point. And Bruce, you are exactly here. These now the ones already said they want B, which is really important because that's the rainfall data. It just means that that they're going to adhere to new standards. But it doesn't.
So it's
You guys have never decided that A is better because we don't have any data on A yet.
Dave said A was better.
A,
You said that A is better because when you read the recommendation online, you have consistently said that we should adhere to MWRD. So I'm just totally confused now. How can you recommend A when it's not in the
I think the and/or, depending on which brings the best, the safest result of it.
Well, that's-
It gives us the latitude we need at this stage in the preliminary plat review.
to get the best result.
We could make a condition on village engineering recommendation to the report.
Well, that's,
Can we just add to A as well something subject to capacity?
No.
The only reason I say that
We-
is because we don't know what capacity is.
That's important. That's implied.
it's implied. Okay, let's begin. I think the simplest thing is let's begin if we can have a motion to adopt the recommendation deleting C4 and adding Peter's condition number 10.
I so move.
Second. We have a motion and a second. Now, consideration of amendments to any of the other conditions that are contained in the report.
I have a question first, which is, what have we done with condition A1? Is that?
We're about to discuss it.
Okay,
That is now
okay.
open for discussion and amendment.
So, do you want to try and state in the way that you just did a moment ago where we said, which is most favorable to the residents and the determination of the village engineer?
Well, I think it's and/or. Wait, Dave, now you want us to do and/or? What are we recommending?
I think that was our,
I had suggested and/or B, whichever is most advantageous, for public safety, the safety of the residents and the determination of the board.
That's comprehensive.
So there's three options.
Okay,
It's
right.
There's
A
A,
or
B,
B or
or
both.
A and B.
A or
Right,
B,
depending on what.
whichever, so they
board
can,
decides.
Whichever's best.
based on all the data they have in front of them, they can make the best determination. Because
Yeah, so that if there's, someone should move that if you feel that.
Okay, I move that amendment.
That's condition A1.
You have a motion and a second, discussion of the amendment.
There is a little known fact about, that I didn't understand until before this meeting. If the basins are bigger when they don't need to be bigger, it's not necessarily an advantage to you, because it means that there will always be, there's a potential for more constant flow, reduced rate, but potential for more constant because there's more water, whereas if the water can go through this overland flow, having more detention is not necessarily an advantage to you. We don't know all that yet, but that's really why I would think it's best if they can make that determination when they see the final plan.
That's correct.
I had not really even understood that.
That amendment gives us that flexibility in the final review.
I mean, we would like, ideally, we would like to push more of the detention not in the southeast corner, but in the northeast corner, right? That's what we, and so my feeling, if this is what's going to give us the most flexibility to accomplish that, if that's what we're saying. Any other discussion on this amendment for the condition?
No.
Can I just do a all in favor, or do I need a roll call?
Let's do a roll call on this.
We're not voting on the whole thing, just the amendment.
Just the amendment.
Just the amendment.
Chair Hubart,
Yes.
Commissioner Miller,
Yes.
Commissioner Neopoulos,
Yes.
Commissioner Underwood,
Yes.
Commissioner Sauer,
Yes.
Commissioner Solon,
Yes.
Commissioner Thompson,
Yes.
Commissioner Turner,
Yes.
and Commissioner Van Ness.
Yes.
Okay, I'm not going to do the, I know a woman who swallowed a fly and recite the motion every time that it gets amended. But for right now, we have a motion that, that adds draft condition D, removes condition C sub 4, and then adds to condition A1 that it is basically either A and or B, which is determined to be the most efficacious for the protection and well-being of the public health, safety, and welfare, and the determination of the village board.
I think we said the village, we
Village
would say
the village board will-
as recommended by the village engineer
As
to the board.
recommended by the village engineer, and then the village board does what it does.
Yeah.
Discussion.
I have a question on the, on condition C, 2. Developers Council raised concern about having the pedestrian route paved. When it says paved, can that be like an echo kind of paver, you know, the type where you can add the grass in it so you really can't see it? It'll be functional for emergency vehicles, or is that going to be substandard for, or does it have to be like some heavy asphalt so you can get like a real, you know, vehicle through that?
Well, there's two things in two separate conditions. One is that we're talking about an easement that permanently accommodates a vehicle, but we're not talking about that being paved. We are talking about the sidewalk, a pedestrian way, being paved. There certainly are pervious paver systems that could be substituted for a concrete sidewalk. They're a little bit harder to shovel and maintain, but whatever we can do to accommodate a green approach, we would support.
Thank you.
From my perspective, with respect to C3, that there needs to be sidewalks on both sides. I think I understand all the good reasons why, but in this case, from my own personal viewpoint, I think less paving is better, and I don't feel the need to support C3.
Do you want to make a motion to delete C3 as a recommended condition?
I'd like to hear from others if anyone has a view on it before I make a motion.
I've got a question that maybe you can't answer, maybe the developer can. What is the, where does the extra sidewalk come from? I assume it doesn't make the street narrower. So we've got 3 more feet of sidewalk, right, approximately. Where does that come from?
All of the sidewalks would have been in the 10-foot easement that exceeds the 40-foot right-of-way.
So it comes from Parkway, effectively?
It comes from within the front yard of the residence on the north side of that entryway. And part of this is, from a planning perspective, trying to establish what amounts to even setbacks on both sides of that street.
I understand not wanting to have unnecessary paving. I recently become more sensitive to people who are in wheelchairs or need to get around. I had this in another community where one family simply couldn't use the sidewalk to get to the train station, even though there were sidewalks everywhere, but they just couldn't get to the sidewalk. They had to be in the street for, 100 feet. So to me, that outweighs. I understand it's a more green look, and I understand all that, but for someone living on this long street that has to get out to someplace, would it be, inconvenience to have to go across the street to get to a sidewalk?
I hadn't thought about the wheelchair, particularly given the target market of what I believe the residents in this area would be. So I think that's an excellent point.
But I live on the street. I don't have a sidewalk on my side. It's just grass, and there's a sidewalk across the way. And I'll say too, you're going to have parked cars, and you're going to have kids trying to cross to get to that sidewalk. I wish we had a sidewalk. I really do. So I think, on first blush, I think the sidewalk is good for buggies. It's good for wheelchairs. It's safer when you have people trying to get to, the school bus or Green Bay Road or on the, just.
Thank you.
One more thing I'm going to add. Lee, I think you mentioned that there'd be a minimal loss of trees in that particular area anyway.
There might be one that I noted that would potentially require moving the sidewalk around it to avoid it, but it isn't the most dense. It is clearly the least dense because it's in that, you'll remember your walk, there's a fairly broad section of open area that has only an occasional tree in there, and that's where that sidewalk would be.
Yeah, for me, the public safety concern outweighs the rest of it. I think for anyone who's impaired for any reason because they're, a child or in a wheelchair, it just would be safer with both sidewalks. That would be my vote.
Also, I thought about the emergency access. We always thought that was at least a consolation if there wasn't a connection to the street network. I rode my bike up there Sunday, and as I was at the end of Northwood, I was thinking about what it would be like to live at the very end of this new subdivision and want to get out to go to the Forest Preserve or Botanic Garden or Ravinia and have to go all the way around. And it just seemed like, no, it's a no-brainer to have some connection. And
There'd be a shortcut for pedestrians. Yeah.
if someone noticed a strange person parked outside your house for a long time on Sunday, that was me. So is there anyone who has a desire to revisit the issue of the emergency lane? We can, okay.
I have a kind of a different issue that's not part of the current conditions. It's actually not a condition, but I'd like to see it somewhere in the narrative that follows the conditions. There have been a number of statements the developer has made that talked about the desire to try to save aspects of the house, of the stables, and other elements of the estate. And I would like to see that aspiration noted in the narrative, understanding that there's a lot of variables in place right now. But I believe the last time that the architect was here, he talked about efforts to try to talk to several parties about moving the stables to Lot 1. There's a lot of opportunity there. There's been discussion about attempting to save aspects of the main house, Mr. Hoover's study. So I think those are really good, and I would like to see those memorialized, even though they're aspirational. So I leave that to our attorney friend to figure out how do we put that into the language without making it binding.
Well, the findings are one section of the report, the narrative is another. If there's no objection, can we just include in the motion to add a statement in the narrative portion of the report, a statement to that effect to the board?
Did you report?
Well, I mean, procedurally, do you have a problem with doing this without even a motion? Just we'll do it, or do you want to?
There's such a thing as unanimous consent.
Okay.
And so if everybody nods and you feel that
The force is with us.
no, well, the gist of what was just suggested, if everybody feels comfortable with that, staff will concretize that into the findings. But it will not be a required condition, but it will be in the findings as something that you wish to see aspire to.
Part of it is a message to the Board of Trustees. It's part of this memo.
And it is in the minutes, it's in our minutes, correct? And they'll see those.
Yep.
And in their presentation, so that's good. And then with the follow-up, I think that's important. So I'm good with it.
We're all nodding.
Okay.
Okay. Any
I've seen
other
that done before.
discussion points?
Yeah, I want to, Peter, I want to just ask you a couple questions about your entry gate proposal.
Sure.
So when I looked at the map, it looked like this was fairly deep inside Lot 1. In other words, it's not right on the sidewalk, it's not right on the property line, these gates.
These are the gates.
I understand, right. So when I was...
And they're about 8 to 10 feet east of the sidewalk, roughly.
Right. So they are different than the ravine bluffs entry markers, for example, which are on some grass, sort of right in front by the sidewalk.
Yes.
This is more on one property owner. So my thought is it, you propose that the HOA maintain it, which I think is good, and not just
Right.
be
Yes.
the property owner, but would it be, you propose the village own it, even though it's inside that one private?
I'm also proposing that the land be donated to the village as well.
And not the HOA, I'm sure you've thought of that.
The land and the masonry bits to the village.
Not, but
And the reason is there are examples within the village where they are privately owned and they are not maintained. They're falling apart. And they are remnants from historic properties. I won't say where they are right now, but there are a lot of examples where they are owned and maintained by the homeowner association. But the purpose here is to ensure their longevity, basically preserve them, right, forever, because they're village owned.
so they're village owned, so the access, so people could, it's not just for the benefit of this one
It's
lot owner.
because of the uniqueness of these, I think you could make a pretty reasonable argument that they are an asset to the village and that they are extremely unique historically, given their provenance. So, to me, how do you ensure their longevity? What's the best way? And then number two, how do you ensure their long-term maintenance? So what's kind of nice about this idea is that if the homeowner association defaults, there's a fallback position sometime out in the future. What is unique about the Frank Lloyd Wright ones are those are village-owned and maintained. Those are the only ones, per my understanding. But they were also built that way from the get-go. The land was carved out for those. Here, because it's private property, those were on private property. I should note that the metal fencing behind them was a much more recent addition, much more part of our time. These things date from the mid-1920s.
Could I ask if the commissioner would be open to the possibility, and we can explore the possibility of an outright dedication, the possibility of a preservation easement that would run in favor of and inure to the benefit of the village, which, we wouldn't have to deal with the issue of it having a separate tax pin and things like that and taking it off the tax rolls. If you could give us some flexibility there to work with the developer in a way that ensures that the village would have an interest and a right to preserve these without necessarily taking fee title to them.
Sure. I think what I was looking for was a mechanism to ensure their preservation. And whether it's a preservation easement or if certified landmark status is another one it's also could be a possibility. But if it's creating more headache than what it needs to be, there's good, yeah.
What is certified landmark status?
Okay. I'm sorry, Bruce. We went down a tangent road.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. In the village of Glencoe, there are 2 levels of landmark status. One is honorary, and the other one is certified. Both provide some protection, but certified provides a much greater level of protection. If you wanted to tear it down, if it was a certified landmark, you would have to seek approval from the Preservation Commission and then have that ratified by the village trustees. Where if it's honorary landmark status, there's a time period that you have to wait for demolition, but there is no real mechanism to prevent demolition.
I would say that a preservation easement is easier to deal with, faster, less onerous.
The other one, it doesn't preclude doing the other one, too.
It doesn't preclude it, but is the condition stated?
Historic Preservation Commission, that's the
Okay. The condition doesn't require the developer to do this. It recommends that the board, I just want to be careful that we don't.
The condition. About condition 10?
Yes.
Condition 10 says donated.
Yes, it's donated.
Well, I think
Not
it.
at their option.
Well, I think it should, I don't know that we have the ability to require a donation. as a matter of subdivision.
So that the developer shall donate, dedicate, or otherwise grant such interests as the village attorney deems necessary to ensure the preservation.
Okay.
So that's an amendment to draft 10, to draft condition 10, which has been incorporated. Is there a motion to?
Motion to approve?
Accept that amendment?
Second. Roll call?
Chair Huber?
Yes.
Commissioner Miller?
Yes.
Commissioner Neopoulos? Yes. Commissioner Underduck?
Yes.
Commissioner Satter?
Yes.
Commissioner Solon?
Yes.
Commissioner Thompson?
Yes.
Commissioner Turner?
Yes.
Commissioner Van Ness?
Yes?
Okay, at the risk of going down any other rabbit holes, it's okay. Any other? Go ahead, Georgia.
Excuse me. Under B, maintenance and subdivision improvements declaration, didn't know if we could mention in here, unless the village board already understands how it works with homeowners associations, and if they don't do it, it goes to the, I don't know, lien, 30 days, blah, 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 SSA. Can we mention or recommend that we would like an SSA set up at the $0 level or mention the idea of it here so that it's at least spoken about at the village board level? Commissioners?
Sorry,
Do we not-
section B,
B, under maintenance of subdivision improvements, we
Do
spoke
we
about.
fail to mention special service area in the conditions?
I didn't see it anywhere.
I have,
We may have just, that may have been inadvertent.
Is it
Because we
somewhere?
talked about it.
Multiple times.
We talked about it. Oh, thank you.
Is it under, maybe it's...
Romanet 3.
oh, yeah.
And we said capital S.
I know we didn't get, your control F is going to fail you if you look for SSA. It is actually spelled out in English. So it is under section B, Romanet 3. The approvals of the final plat and declaration of the subdivision shall explicitly provide for the creation of a special service area to be created if deemed necessary by the village to ensure that sufficient funds are available to pay for the repair, maintenance, replacement of the common improvements that they may be needed from time to time in the absence of the HOA assessing the future sufficient funds for this purpose.
Thank you. I used it, capital S.
Yeah, when you absolutely positively needed it there yesterday.
There.
Well, it would have been a good catch if we had missed it all. Absolutely.
Given that we're going over B again, there's one thing I noticed, just as a minor point of drafting in B1, we're talking about the obligation of the HOA. A second line there, or replace, and then you say the stormwater detention basins. Later on in 4, we have a defined term, the stormwater detention improvements, and I wonder if we could replace the stormwater detention improvements, the defined term, instead of the stormwater detention basins, just to make it super explicit.
So
You would change the stormwater detention basin to stormwater detention improvements, plan as defined below.
As here and after defined, yes, exactly. Use the defined term.
Yes, yeah, yes, we can do that.
Do you need us to nod?
That I take as a scrivener's error, not a scrivener's error, a
No, just you
scrivener's
drafted
supplement.
this first, exactly.
Yes, so we can do that by, that's not a substantive question.
By acclamation.
By unanimous consent? Yes, we'll get that one.
there's another scrivener that we could fill in, which is we left out outlot
C,
C.
right,
C.
yes.
Well, let's see, right.
late night typing.
In C, just one other thing, in C, Romanet 3,
Right here.
should, no sidewalk shall be required to be installed on A, B, C, or D, but a sidewalk, I think should be shall be installed. I'm wondering, I think should could be inconclusive, optional.
So, to make it clear that you consider that to be a mandatory condition,
Right.
which is recommended, but yes, that you feel strongly about that is not an option. Yes, okay. That we can get that as well.
I'm sorry, where is that again?
It's on, it's C3.
What was it again?
It's no sidewalk shall be required to be installed on outlot A, C, D, or E, but a sidewalk in place of shall be installed along the frontage of all lots with street frontage on Estates Road within the dedicated public utility easements.
I'm sorry, can I go back one more time to B3 with the SSA?
Yeah.
Can we call out specifically the stormwater improvements would also fall under the SSA because it only talks about repair and maintenance, the common improvements defined in
The common
I.
improvements will be defined
Defined.
above as part of,
Oh.
to include the stormwater.
Okay.
Yes,
Do I
we'll
have to
make sure that
understand?
all of those definitions cross-reference each other and include each other.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is
Oh,
there-
there?
In
Yeah, I see it.
moving to adopt the report with the conditions as amended, just to clarify me if I'm wrong, we're recommending all of the report with the conditions as amended, as well as the findings, the whole body of the report. In other words, it's a comprehensive document that we are transmitting to the village board, including the discussion and narrative part of it,
Including the responses to the standards.
including the responses to the standards. Other comments, questions?
The conversation I was attempting to put forward earlier on page 8, it states, petitioner's plans for the proposed subdivision call for the demolition or removal of the 3 existing structures on the subject property. That's what I was asking for, a different way to say that. About the aspirations of the developer.
Where are you,
Page 8.
Well, you're reading,
We're on
you're,
page 8.
you're reading in the
Which
finding.
point?
I thought you wanted the statement to go back further in the, or further before that in the narrative.
Well, yes, I do, but the page 8,
Oh, the very top.
page 8 at the top,
It's
number 2,
5, 2.
5, and under findings, number 2, that says the other way.
Yeah. Do you want us to change it, or are you?
I would like to have that changed. I have what I mentioned earlier, I want to say it again. What we said earlier is incorporated.
You want it to go in that place?
No, I want this sentence to change in what we said earlier to stay where we said it should go.
Wait.
So this sentence on top of page 8,
Petitioner's plans for the proposed subdivision call for the demolition and removal of 3 existing structures on the subject property.
right, and
Your suggestion is,
that they are investigating methods to preserve
but they are
aspects.
investigating, that they are,
Petitioner's plans for the subdivision call
I would note that this is a finding about nonconformities, and that the inclusion of that demolition is simply stating that the existing structures do not have any nonconformities, and under the current plan, that they would be demolished. So this is simply a recitation about the creation of nonconformities by this. So I don't know if the aspirational language is appropriate here, because it's just a discussion of whether this subdivision will create non-conforming conditions which would be in violation of either the subdivision or zoning code.
But does the term removal then cover if they move the stables?
It's, I'll let Lee.
If it is moved, it would have to be moved to a place that would be conforming, or they would have to seek a variation for that movement.
Yes.
All that finding basically states is that as platted, this subdivision doesn't require any variations beyond the ones that are being requested.
Okay.
we might be getting close to being ready to vote on the motion with all of the amendments. But I'm looking around to see if anyone else has any last thought, question, comment. To those of you before we take the vote who've been with us through all these meetings, and at least when I cast a vote, and the other commissioners can speak for themselves, it would only be because I think this is protective and is in the best interest of the residents, given all that we have to adjust and look at with the ordinances and what we can do and what we can't do. And I feel exactly how you would feel if a problem were to emerge. And none of us up here, I think that we're doing anything that would, needlessly or recklessly lead to that. None of us think that at all, unless you think differently. So, and there is a philosophical difference. I understand that it would be more assuring if everything was final. But my understanding of where we are with our ordinances is that we have to take some action at the preliminary level. And if I thought that they couldn't even make a feasible case, or, for being reasonable that they could get this done, then I wouldn't vote for the preliminary. But that's the standard that I think we have to look at in looking at a preliminary application. And if anyone disagrees, then they'll vote no on the motion, I suppose. If anyone else wants to say anything now, or when you cast your vote, you can. But I just wanted to tell you that I thank you all for your participation. We made the project, we think, better because of all of your participation. All those questions were funneled many times back and forth to staff and the developer, and it's a collaborative process. So, if anyone else has anything else, can we have a roll call?
Chair Huber?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner Neopoulos?
Aye.
Commissioner Underwood?
Yes.
Commissioner Satter?
Yes.
Commissioner Solon?
Yes.
Commissioner Thompson?
Yes.
Commissioner Turner?
Yes.
And Commissioner Van Dyke?
Yes.
The motion passes, and the next, this docket will then be taken to the Board of Trustees at its October meeting, at which point it will be considered on its agenda. Public will have an opportunity to discuss, and then begins a process where staff works with the applicant to review engineering plans. And then under the subdivision code, they come back through the Plan Commission again with a final plat that needs to be in substantial conformance with this plat as conditioned, incorporating all the conditions that the board will adopt. And then at that point, it will go through a public meeting where the public will have a chance to speak as well. And then it goes back once again, finally, to the Board of Trustees. Once again, the timeline there is not exact. There's a 12-month interval under which a preliminary approval would be good and that they have the time to work with. And unless there's any other procedural matter, sorry, I just kind of stepped in there, but wanted to at least give that.
I love that you do that. If there's nothing else for the order, then a motion to adjourn?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
We're adjourned.